At that moment, a person with a sinister smile asked a question and announced that a war had begun. Meanwhile, one side in the war had 37,463 soldiers, and the opponent had an even greater number. The other side, in contrast, had 100,000 combatants. Then the person smiled again and asked which side they thought had won. But the young students only stared in silence, without answering. The teacher showed sadness for receiving no answers and asked someone to take a guess. 2 students raised their hands, choosing the first army as the winner. Curious, she asked the reason for their choice. The spiky-haired student replied, mentioning the number 37,463. At that moment, a crowd of soldiers appeared in formation. He stated that a group that knows its exact strength wouldn't lose to an army of 100,000. The teacher observed them silently, letting them reflect on the answer. Soon after, she reacted with surprise and joy, declaring the student the winner. With enthusiasm, she said that knowledge is more powerful than strength, and that this should never be forgotten. Finally, she stated that only those who understand this truth can become true knights. Immediately, the image of a knight appeared, and a question was asked about what defines one. The sword, bound by chains, symbolized honor and justice, showing how knights give their lives for those values and see a noble death as a privilege. In that era, many went to war and were considered true heroes. Suddenly, the teacher questioned how quickly the student had answered, jokingly saying he had hurt her feelings. He simply looked at her thoughtful. Then she reminded them that the test would be the next day, warning that they were poorly prepared and would fail if they repeated that performance. Tired, the students looked at her in silence. With a mischievous smile, she warned that no one would go easy on them during the test and ordered them to get ready. The 2 students were frightened by the implied threat. Finally, she ended the class, demanding 100 repetitions of the exercise from everyone, except the student who got the answer right. With the news, the exhausted students were left panting. Assuming a more serious tone, the teacher warned that she didn't want any more fights and promised punishments if it happened again. Soon after, she vanished in a cloud of smoke, leaving the students behind. Meanwhile, they approached the classmate who had fallen to the ground. Worried, one of them lamented how they would manage 100 repetitions and if they would finish in time before the test, while another helped Luce stand up. A student poked the fallen classmate, who only murmured something. Another asked why he had passed out from a single blow, and Luce replied that the teacher's kick was really strong. Soon, one of them asked Najin if he was going home, and he confirmed. The green-haired student complained that it was nice to be dismissed, and Najin agreed. Annoyed, the other said he had watched everything during the training with Thadian. Upon hearing this, Najin stared at him seriously. The green-haired boy then prepared to attack. He launched a strike at the teacher. She blinked, showing no reaction. With narrowed eyes, she remained expressionless. Suddenly, her eyes widened in terror. Instinctively, she grabbed the attacker's wrist tightly, trying to restrain him. Even so, she didn't hold back from counterattacking. She threw the student into another. Luce was startled when he saw her looking at him. With a furious gaze, she rushed at him with extreme speed. Then she hit him with a kick that sent him flying backward. Luce, gasping, reacted as he tried to understand what was happening. Soon after, she stood over the fallen students, ready to continue, with a tense body and clenched fists. 2 classmates watched the scene in shock, and one of them showed irritation by clenching his fists. Najin stared at them seriously. The green-haired boy grabbed Najin, shouting that he was just watching despite being the strongest and that teamwork was essential for knights. Najin's eyes closed for a moment and reopened with a red glow. The attacker clenched his teeth and insisted that he had already warned him. He tightened his fist, demanding that Najin stop ignoring him, his voice full of frustration. Najin then moved quickly, his red eyes focused intensely. At the same moment, a student intervened, shouting for them to stop and blocking the green-haired boy's strike. Right after, he reminded them they'd be disqualified if they fought again, since Fedian wouldn't tolerate another conflict. The green-haired one glared at him, still irritated and panting. Luce, crouched, remained silent, while another classmate said he didn't even want to understand all of that. Firmly, the same student suggested that they all begin the exercise at once. Faced with this, the green-haired one grumbled and walked away, snorting in irritation. Meanwhile, Luce and another classmate also shrank back, and one of them thought that perhaps the punishment was deserved, feeling a slight weight of guilt. Soon after, the angry boy complained that there was something strange about Najin, saying he had always been rude, but now he was even worse, and he shouldn't have just watched. The black-haired student asked them to give Najin a break, explaining that it would be even stranger if he were still the same after what happened. The other one observed him in silence, clenching his teeth, with anger still in his eyes. Then the black-haired student said that the pain of losing one's family was more cruel than one could imagine and could destroy someone from within. At that moment, Najin began to walk away, moving in silence. His footsteps echoed as he walked farther, as if each step pulled him further from reality. Soon after, he stopped and looked at the sky. In silence, he let out a sigh, staring at the orange sky where clouds were slowly fading. As he watched the horizon, his expression turned thoughtful. Soon, he opened his mouth. His lips moved without making a sound, still contemplating the sky. In silence, he kept watching the sunset, as if searching for answers among the golden and red tones. Then he thought that it had worked and wondered if anyone had noticed. He knew that everyone was aware of the fire that destroyed his house last week. With that, his only brother turned to ashes. But there was a secret no one knew, a truth no soul was aware of. The fact that it was him who had been there, and unfortunately, he had killed his own brother. Najin took a violent hit to the face. A week earlier, on the day everything happened, he had already fallen. At that moment, he was sitting on the ground, holding his head while two students stared at him with expressions of contempt and unease. He wiped his eyes, revealing a reddish glow. The three of them looked at the boy, and one of them mumbled something like an apology hesitantly. More blows were heard, dry and strong. He fell to the ground, coughing, trying to catch his breath. One of the students was panting, while the other smiled, enjoying his suffering. Soon, one of them suggested leaving, and Luce hesitated before agreeing, distressed. Then he spat something on the face of the boy lying on the ground. The students walked away with heavy steps, and one of them cursed at him, making his sense of superiority clear. After that, he slowly raised his head. He ran his hand through his hair and gently patted it in an unexpectedly soft manner. As he lifted his red eyes, he pulled something sticky from the strands. Keeping his gaze upward, he thought of something he always did. He hated that village, remaining silent like someone who had already given up on being understood. Right ahead, there was a flyer with his image. He raised his red eyes and looked forward, trying to ignore the content. A customer left some coins and asked for a copy of the flyer without looking at him. Soon after, someone hit him with the same flyer, as if he was unworthy even of the paper. He lowered his gaze, his red eyes still showing. Behind the counter, the man watched him silently, rigid and cold. At that moment, he thought the man's eyes expressed contempt. He bent down to pick up the flyer from the ground, reflecting on his skill and reading expressions. He also thought about how he had learned to control his own face to protect himself. He agreed inwardly, realizing he could no longer smile or cry. On the other side, the man thought he needed to remain indifferent. He walked away, pretending it bothered him less, though he knew that wasn't true. He walked pensively, revealing he wasn't as indifferent as he seemed. The flyer he carried was dripping water, smudging the printed image. As he walked, he thought of himself as a rising star and the top training spot for knights. He also believed he was the second most promising and the most popular in a national survey, trying to reaffirm his worth. His red eyes reflected his origin, the Fire Village, Wudian. Suddenly, he held the paper and identified himself as Najin. Still, he showed a faint smile, recognizing that he couldn't always control his expressions. The man who approached him said he would pay only half. With that, he asked in shock why the pay was reduced, feeling sick to his stomach. He quickly protested, saying he had fulfilled everything, and demanded to know why he'd receive only half. The man explained that he had left the post during his shift, justifying the cut. Indignant, he exclaimed that it was unacceptable, trying to keep his composure. He was interrupted, being told he would receive only a third. He responded by saying it only happened because Lujin and the others dragged him away by force. Even so, the man stated that the payment would drop to a quarter. The man, holding the papers, stared at him as he showed anguish. He soon reminded him that he was the only one in the village willing to hire him. Surprised, the boy widened his eyes. Then he lowered his gaze with a restrained expression, while thinking that he couldn't cry or make a grim face. Thus, he understood that he needed to keep an apathetic expression. With that, he crumpled the paper, convinced it was what he deserved. Suddenly, someone pointed at him and shouted out his presence. Right after, something almost hit him as it passed by. A stone rolled across the floor. He saw students with slingshots calling him an idiot and saying they missed. He then challenged them to aim better next time. At that moment, a stone hit him on the head. A decade ago, he saw the village in flames, aware that he was the criminal who caused the fire. Even so, he opened the soaked pamphlet, believing everything would soon come to an end. Suddenly, he ran his hand over his face. He turned his gaze when a loud impact echoed. Soon after, he apologized as he saw a hand reaching out. Then he just watched with a thoughtful look. He realized it was Najin standing in front of him. With a smile, he asked if he was okay. He soon accepted the help, saying he was fine. But he reflected that, while he did nothing, his brother saved the villagers. That was when he became the village hero. His only precious family as they walked was being observed by someone else. A boy watched them from a distance. Najin, curious, asked if what his brother was holding was a magazine. As he tried to answer, the brother interrupted, saying he was the reason for the magazine. Smiling, he said he was embarrassed, but the brother joked that it really was him. Upon hearing this, he was shocked, thinking he wasn't the reason for the purchase, but the brother said it was a joke and that he knew it was him. Then he showed the magazine for him to see, revealing it to be the Continent of Attractions. Smiling, he asked what he thought and said it looked fun. Upon hearing this, his expression changed and he soon asked why. Najin just smiled and didn't respond. Then he asked if his brother remembered how, as kids, they always talked about going on a grand adventure. With that, he declared his wish to leave that village. He smiled as he imagined himself traveling the world, icy deserts, crystal seas, rocky mountains, and distant lands. Najin smiled, seeing himself as the adventurer and his brother as the knight. meeting wherever they went. Hearing this, Najin answered that he did. As he approached the house, a voice asked if he wasn't upset and told him not to cry from longing. He was shocked to hear if he could move forward alone, while the sound of the door opening played, and he thought that, by becoming an apprentice, he would receive some help. Suddenly, a hooded and shadowy figure loomed over him. Surprised, he commented that the person was in the wrong house when something passed close to his face. A sharp object nearly hit his red eye. A sharp blade stuck into the wood with a crack. Then, a hooded figure wearing a red mask looked up. With that, Najin fixed his gaze on the intense glow in front of him. As the masked figure raised the sword, he stopped the motion by grabbing the blade, while Najin watched in fear. Right after, he kept a serious expression, but Najin beside him looked shocked, asking what was happening. Meanwhile, other masked figures commented that he had blocked the attack, noting that he was strong. Afraid, Najin asked who the attackers were, while his brother extended his hand to protect him. At that moment, Najin looked at the older one, who was trying to reach him with his hand. Realizing by how they wielded their swords and what they were saying, he understood that the attack was real. With seriousness, Najin asked if they were there to kill him and challenged them to try. Next, one of the figures mocked Najin, who was watching the scene, calling him a brave hero. Then he confirmed their intention and asked if he would simply give up and die there. Without hesitation, Najin replied that was exactly what they wanted, so he rushed forward into battle. With a powerful kick, he hit one of the attackers, who was thrown back. Then he grabbed the sword blade with his hand, keeping his gaze steady and determined. Thinking he was outnumbered, he grabbed his own weapon. He didn't know who the enemies were, nor what weapons they use, and everything felt uncertain. Even so, he assessed that entering that narrow place full of enemies would put him at a disadvantage. Despite that, he remained firm at the entrance, hearing the clash of swords. He reflected that the worst would be if Najin were kidnapped, as there would be nothing he could do. Determined, he concluded that he would fight alone against all of them, treating that mess as garbage he had to take out of the house. Although that put him at risk, his aura intensified by the second. In the end, he believed his decision was the right one. Outside, Najin banged on the door, shouting to be let in. With an anguished look, he heard the insistent calling from the other side. Meanwhile, he swung his sword, hitting one of the attackers. Suddenly, another masked figure approached from behind, wielding a knife. He dodged quickly, knocking two enemies to the ground. A blade grazed his body, but he remained focused. With a precise strike, he landed a strong punch on one of the masked attackers. Soon after, another assailant expressed surprise as he felt something pulsing in his hand. As he swung his sword again, he landed a clean cut on one of the opponents. Meanwhile, a flash of energy passed dangerously close to his eye. Right after, the tip of a blade brushed his face, highlighting the imminent danger. With a leap, he dodged an attack from one of the masked figures while holding his sword. At the same moment, he jumped again, avoiding multiple enemy strikes. Even with a slight bleeding, he concluded that the space was tight and the enemies were fast, but he had already figured them out. Now he was only concerned about the leader. While four of the masked ones already showed signs of fatigue, he kept his focus. He thought the only unknown factor was the commander of the group, who hadn't made a single move yet. At that moment, the masked leader watched the situation carefully. Surprised, he admitted that Najin was stronger than he had expected. Given that, he reached for his own sword, deciding he could no longer delay the fight. Sensing the imminent advance, Najin prepared for combat. Soon after, the masked leader gripped his sword, ready for battle. However, he hesitated while holding the sword, watching Najin closely. Meanwhile, Najin banged on the door forcefully, calling for his brother and asking if he was okay. Then the enemy looked away, while Najin raised his head, his red eyes glowing intensely. At that moment, his decisions were proving to be almost always right. With that, Najin scratched the door, promising to go get help. Suddenly, the structure collapsed and Najin fell, struck by the debris. Frightened, he looked up and covered his face with his hand. However, he was caught by the arms of his brother, who stared at the ceiling, convinced he was making the right choice. Even so, Najin knew that making the right choice didn't always mean winning, as the opponent watched him with sword in hand. Surprised, the leader acknowledged his ability to block the attack, but claimed he still wasn't a match for him. Even trembling and coughing, Najin kept his eyes fixed on the blade of his own sword. As soon as the opponent raised his sword again, he asked if he could endure another blow or if he would try to dodge. Najin, in shock, just stared at him, unable to say a word. Meanwhile, the masked man waited anxiously for an answer, watching the serious expression on his face. Soon, a long, precise slash struck the house on the hill. Finally, the blow landed on Najin's back, making him fall while still shielding his brother. In pain, Najin looked up. The assailant stared at him, noticing that Najin had still tried to counterattack despite being wounded. Meanwhile, he spun his sword in the air. Then he touched his own mask and realized that the opponent had chosen to defend, not attack. Staggering, Najin held the bloodied body in front of him and asked why he had done that, saying it wasn't worth sacrificing himself for him. The leader ordered them to finish it quickly, as they needed to leave, but one of the masked men murmured something about family, which the chief immediately questioned. Soon after, he drew his weapon again, while the two brothers remained lying on the ground. In an unexpected gesture, he extended his hand, offering a choice. Nejin kept his gaze steady and determined. Then, the enemy proposed to Nagin that he kill his brother in order to live. Immediately, Nagin's eyes widened, completely shocked by the suggestion. In that instant, he thought that he and Nejin were twins. He remembered that, unlike most siblings, they had always been best friends. He recalled that Nejin was weak as a child, and he always ran to defend him whenever he was bullied. In a distant memory, Nejin apologized, saying everything was his fault, while Nagin looked annoyed. Surprised, Nagin told him to stop apologizing. Then he declared that this is what brothers do, promising to stand by his side if needed. With determination, he stated that Nejin was his only brother. Soon he hugged him tightly, ignoring the blood, showing that he was all he had. Suddenly, a hand pulled a blood-stained blade from his body, and there was a secret no one knew. The sword fell to the ground with a dull thud, while the metallic sound echoed around. Horrified, Nejin looked at his own hands and revealed the truth. He was the real Nejin. With a terrified expression, he turned his eyes away. In silence, he stared at the body lying before him, believing that he had killed him. Finally, with a sad smile, he concluded that he had taken the life of his own brother. The masked figure held his sword, ordering Nejin's death in exchange for his brother's life. With that, the shock was reflected in Nagin's eyes, which widened in disbelief at what he had heard. His hand trembled on the hilt of the weapon, unable to understand the reason for such a cruel and sudden choice. Furious, he refused to obey, challenging the enemy to a fight, even with no apparent chance. The masked man responded with a subtle question, laced with irony and contempt. Nejin then closed his eyes tightly, as if sealing his decision. In silence, he shut them completely, prepared to face whatever came. Nejin shouted for his brother to hold on a little longer, promising to hold him off until help arrived, even without knowing if it would. In the next instant, he was stopped by him, who begged him not to do it. Nejin began to bleed from his mouth, where he stated that he wouldn't stand a chance against them. Even so, he gripped the hilt of the blade tightly, saying that neither of them could die there, not like that. His face twisted in pain, reflecting the intense suffering coursing through his body. Three masked figures watched the scene in absolute silence, like cold judges of an inevitable sentence. The edge of the sword, covered in blood, dripped without pause, staining the ground with traces of the event. Suddenly, Nagin, his eyes filled with shock, drove the blade into his brother's chest, piercing through to his back. His eyes showed utter despair, and he began to say his brother's name between sobs. With his hands over his on the sword's hilt, he kept calling for him over and over. At that moment, Nejin bled from the mouth, murmuring his name through clenched teeth with effort. He lifted his head with wide eyes, trying to say something, but couldn't finish the sentence. Then he fell to the ground, leaving his brother stunned. Everything was happening so suddenly that he didn't know how to react. His eyes opened wide, glowing with an intense and furious light. He saw the masked men walking away in silence, taking firm steps. As they left, they declared that their mission had been accomplished, as if sealing the fate of that night. One of them stated that the flame of Woodian had been extinguished, with a cold and indifferent voice. Shortly after, Nejin stood in the silence, unable to react as a voice echoed, saying only ashes remained, mocking the loss. Then a spark ignited a piece of paper on the wall, starting the destruction. Quickly, the fire spread through the entire structure, swallowing everything in flames. Nejin remained on his knees, alone amidst the growing blaze, as if frozen in time. He looked around, unable to understand why it had happened, dazed. With wide eyes, he questioned the situation, searching for a meaning he could not find. Before Nejin's body in the flames, he asked why he had to die, his voice trembling. Bleeding and with teary eyes, he tried to express a thought that wouldn't come out, choked by pain. He remembered a promise, that he would protect anyone who troubled his brother, no matter the cost. His face now bore the pain and weight of that memory, marked by tragedy. He also recalled his brother's words, he was his only family, and that hurt more than any wound. At that moment, he stared at the fallen body with red eyes, full of rage and grief. With determination, he picked up the sword left on the ground, feeling its weight as an extension of his own pain. He used it to cut off his ponytail, declaring that it wouldn't end there, not ever. He pulled the ribbon from his hair and said the one who died that day was Nejin, closing a cycle. Amidst the fire consuming him, he proclaimed his new name as a vow of vengeance. Addressing his brother, he asked permission to use his identity, respectfully, and from that moment on, he himself would be Nejin, taking the name as a sworn oath. Outside, the young man watched the ruins beneath a purple sky, smoke rising slowly in silence. With a serious gaze, he revealed that there had been 5 of them in total, engraving it in his memory. With that, he completed the statement about the number involved, marking a target on each one. He reflected that there might be even more enemies, but that didn't matter now. He asked himself if they had come to kill him, hoping they would try, because now he was ready. Their mission was to kill him, but the reason wasn't the heaviest burden, there was something bigger behind it. What truly mattered to him was vengeance, burning hotter than the fire around him. Najin wondered how to take revenge on faceless criminals, but concluded that it wouldn't be a problem, only a matter of time. As soon as he took up the sword, He knew that by living as his brother, he would attract their enemies with ease. He believed they would come to finish him off, and that was the real problem he had to face. The masked men whispered among themselves that the one who blocked the attack had been the Jinn, surprised by the unexpected action. Among them, the one with the diamond symbol stood out as a leader, imposing and silent. They knew who he was and even guided him, which could only mean something greater behind it all. With a murmur, he said it had all been a waste, as if mourning the way things turned out. Surprise overtook his gaze as he tried to understand what it truly meant without success. The professor, perhaps the diamond-masked one, knew her true identity, and even so, it was a waste. He turned his head, wondering why they said waste instead of pity, since the words carried different meanings. Fadian explained that, although the others mistreated him for not being a good fighter, she saw potential in him from the beginning. She smiled gently, stating that it was precisely why it was a true waste, something hard to ignore. He looked at her seriously, beginning to question her intentions with such an ambiguous statement. With his eyes fixed on the professor, he asked what she meant by that, expecting a direct answer. He wondered if she truly was the Knight Fadian, and what that would mean for his life from now on. With his hand gripping the sword's hilt, he reflected on the gravity of the discovery that was beginning to take shape. She complimented the weapon he carried, asking where he had gotten it, with a curious look. Right after, she wanted to know if he had bought it, testing his reaction to the question. He replied that it was a gift, suspecting whether he was being tested or if it was just provocation. The professor smiled slightly, returning with another question. Is that so? As if she knew more than she let on. He confirmed it but quickly pushed the idea aside, thinking it impossible for her to be who he feared, trying to stay rational. That's when he realized she was very strong. He then saw that Nejin was strong too, but not strong enough to defeat a knight. In a playful tone, she told him to relax, revealing she had come to say something, not to ask about the sword. He remained skeptical, wondering if it was another one of her strange jokes, which never gave him peace. Then her hand rested gently on his shoulder, warming him with surprise. Fadian hugged him from behind, whispering that he was doing the best he could with unexpected tenderness. With that, shock overtook his face, unable to hide the confusion and impact of that gesture. He questioned since when she knew. Was it from the beginning? And was the white doe involved? Was it her who had killed Nejin? Or was she just testing his reaction? Overcome with confusion, he asked what was going on, since all he could do was play the role. He had to imitate Nejin's voice, expressions, and even appearance, because now he was Nejin. He thought he could fool everyone, even with doubts. No one had proof. Fadian laughed softly, as if she had known everything all along. Then she burst into laughter, praising him as a flawless Nejin without any cracks. As she caressed him, she commented that his gaze, voice, and confusion were perfect. She said that if he had corrected her, she would have thought he wasn't Nejin, so his answer was ideal. Nejin became uneasy upon realizing that she knew everything and spoke as if it were obvious he was Nejin. As he panicked, Fadian calmed him, saying you can't deceive someone who already knows the truth. She reminded him that she was only there to tell him something important. With a tap on his nose, she said he was still doing a sloppy job as always. She moved close to his face and stated he wasn't made to become Nejin. She added that it was just a piece of advice. She let go of his face with a gesture that was somewhere between affection and criticism. Then she waved, saying she'd see him the next day, as if nothing had happened. She then vanished into the air under Nejin's perplexed gaze, who could barely react. He stared into the empty space, frowning, lost in thought. Cold sweat ran down his face, a sign of growing nervousness. He wondered what he would do now that his identity had been discovered. He thought that luckily, Fadian didn't seem interested in exposing the truth, but he questioned her advice. The phrase "you weren't made to become Nejin" echoed in his mind. He wondered if he could trust her, for even though she was intimidating, she didn't seem like a direct threat. He concluded that the most important thing was Nejin's revenge, and for that, he needed a target. The next day, a cheerful voice greeted everyone with a good morning under the radiant sun. Fadian enthusiastically announced that it was a perfect day for the exam, and asked if everyone had rested well. A student expressed nervousness at the teacher's enthusiasm, and another quickly agreed. Fadian stepped firmly and warned that the question was not rhetorical, demanding an immediate answer. The students responded hastily, trying to avoid reprimand. Then a hand was raised, saying there was something urgent that needed to be explained. With a serious expression, Fadian explained that those who passed would become apprentices, and could even die. She pointed to the students before her, who watched her in silence, feeling the weight of reality. Then she asked who still had doubts, with a firm and direct tone. Luce and a classmate remained silent, uncomfortable with the tension in the air. Fadian widened her eyes and asked who wanted to give up, challenging them. All the students responded with determined expressions, without backing down. Fadian smiled, ready to begin the exam with her usual intensity. She pointed forward and energetically announced the beginning of the Knight Apprenticeship exam. Everyone looked surprised when another figure suddenly appeared before the group. A new knight, Ludica, introduced herself as the one responsible for the Northern Knights and said she looked forward to working with everyone. Fadian grew irritated and scolded Ludica for interrupting her at such an important moment. While Ludica cried, Fadian scolded her for calling her a crybaby and told her to stop. Two students discussed the exam, wondering if it would test strength or involve combat between them, which would give Najin an advantage. Najin wondered if they were already there, watching from a distance, ready to act. He thought the culprits might be among the students and that he needed to analyze each one of them. Soon a student approached and asked if Najin was okay, with a worried look. Surprised, Najin asked what he meant, wondering if something was wrong with his appearance or behavior. He thought he had played the part well and questioned where he might have slipped without realizing. The student replied that he just seemed too calm, which worried him at that moment. Najin looked away, thanking him, but said that wasn't what was bothering him. Fedian's phrase, "You're not meant to become Najin," echoed in his mind relentlessly. He wondered if that's what she had meant from the start. With that air of certainty, another student raised his hand to get Fedian's attention, breaking the tense silence. Lujin then asked about the content of the test, eager for answers. Fedian caressed Ludica's face, who was still crying with visible emotion. She then gently let go of her face and smiled, trying to calm her down. She mentioned that the students must be excited, and two of them sincerely expressed their eagerness. Clearing her throat, she said she needed to explain her role for the day clearly. Fedian explained that she would be the examiner of the test, stepping in only if the main examiner tried to kill someone. She reassured them, saying they wouldn't die during the exam, which would last 3 intense days. The tip of Ludica's umbrella struck the ground forcefully, cracking it with surprising impact. Ludica then revealed that the test would be to defeat a knight, which made everyone anxious. She asked which of the students would be the first to challenge her, with firmness in her voice. Fedian warned that Ludica wouldn't go easy on them like she would, leaving the warning in the air. With a serious expression, she paused before finishing her caution. She added that Ludica was even stronger than her, while the knight radiated a powerful and oppressive aura. Najin and another student stared at her, visibly stunned by what they heard and saw. Even if 10 apprentices attacked together, they still wouldn't be able to defeat someone like her. At that moment, he thought about how absurd the requirement was, defeating a knight just to become an apprentice. Realizing the gravity of the situation, he concluded he would never pass the exam. After all, that exam was crucial for Nagyun, since his brother was seen as a future knight. More than that, it was the only way to prove to the bandits that he was still alive. He saw the test as the first step in his revenge, and faced with that situation, he needed to find a loophole. Soon after, Ludica seemed to cry, her eyes turned upward. Meanwhile, she said they were all weak and asked if anyone dared face her, while the students stood or lay fallen. Then she turned to Najin, asking if he would attempt to strike. She soon called him boy. Distressed by the question, he replied that he would not. Fedian then announced the end of that night. The scene shifted to outside, with the purple sky shining above. Shortly after, the group dragged their feet forward, exhausted after the long day. Everyone was visibly shaken after the ordeal. One of the students stood at the center of the area. At that moment, Lujin turned around, his hair swaying and his expression serious. At the same time, Najin and another student observed the scene, one of them leaning forward. Soon after, Lujin and Najin locked eyes, with visible tension between them. Without hesitation, Lujin confronted his peer, saying he had only seen him watching, not acting. Najin looked away, maintaining a neutral expression. Lujin's gaze clearly showed his irritation and focus. That was when Najin's eyes glowed red. Noticing it, Lujin asked how they could defeat Ludica, and whether he had already found a weak point. Surprised, Najin reacted to being called a genius. Even so, the other said he was the new supposed knight, but admitted that to win, they would need to strike by surprise. He suggested they act while she was asleep or distracted. Right after, Fedian raised a finger and smiled enigmatically. Najin thought that, with 3 days of trials, using that strategy wouldn't break any rules if executed well. Surprised, Tyre asked if he was being serious. Then Tyre protested, saying that everyone wanted to become knights and that he wouldn't allow something dishonorable. Another student agreed, insisting they needed to win fairly face to face. Meanwhile, Najin kept his eyes closed, silent. Even while sweating, Lujin said that if they joined forces, they could beat her with a good plan. Right after, the second day of the exam began. In the center of the field, Ludica stood tall while the students approached cautiously. At that moment, Lujin looked at Tur, who responded with a slight nod. With that, everyone stomped firmly on the ground, ready to act. As soon as Ludica showed she was prepared, the students charged quickly. At the front, one of them tried to dodge a strike delivered with the umbrella. Right after, his eyes widened in shock at the intensity of the scene. At that same moment, he was hit hard and thrown back. Then Ludica walked past the fallen body, while Lujin watched from a distance. Seeing that, he clenched his fist, determined to react. He then threw a powerful punch at her. Ludica blocked the attack with the umbrella handle. She spun with force, creating a flash of energy. Even injured, Lujin had to endure. The plan was simple: hit her with their strongest attacks. They needed to stop her from using the umbrella, but they had to force her to use it. He shouted for them to surround her. The group followed the strategy. Ludica prepared herself for all three. She watched their movements, wondering if they were plotting something. She concluded that despite their efforts, they were just kids. She opened the umbrella in Tyre's direction, then quickly closed it, taking him by surprise. The light-haired student took the blow head-on. Lujin let out a shout, signaling his order. Hearing the shout, Tyre's eyes widened. In a movement, he grabbed the tip of the umbrella. He was dragged by the force of the strike. For a moment, the instructor didn't understand. Knowing it was the moment, she shouted for Najin to attack her. She looked back, thinking the boy wasn't participating. She threw the umbrella toward another student. Her umbrella opened mid-attack. She found it cute that a student thought he could defeat her. But then her eyes opened, realizing the mistake. He was just a decoy. Behind her was the real opponent, where Lawson would deliver the final blow. While the boy prepared, she remained still. Then her eyes widened upon seeing Lawson readying the strike. With teary eyes, she realized they were trying really hard. A tear fell, lamenting that it wouldn't be enough. A surprising twist, expressing astonishment. 4 students shivered from a sudden chill. The more skilled ones knew that aura and gaze could decide a duel. Lawson could barely breathe or move, feeling her power. His expression revealed how hard it was to withstand the pressure. At the same time, Ludica's hair stirred. Her gaze seemed to question the situation. To some, her aura was just a faint shiver. Even so, she was surprised by Najin's lack of reaction. She took on a darker form, announcing she would test his strength. Suddenly, a hand grabbed her shoulder. It was Professor Fadienne, who appeared smiling. Fadienne held Ludica and ordered her to stop. It was enough. Taking a deep breath, Ludica agreed to end it. Thus, the second day of the exam was concluded. Students lay across the cracked ground. Kneeling, Lucian expressed frustration over the defeat. Some were recovering, others watched in silence. Nejin spoke up, believing he had discovered something. He turned to his classmates, facing their curious eyes. He declared he knew how to defeat Ludica. Lucian, shocked, asked how that was possible. Najin silenced him, placing a hand over his mouth. He explained that he wouldn't give details, but would lead them to victory. He reaffirmed firmly, assuring them he was confident in the plan. The third day dawned, and Ludica and the students gathered for the final exam. Fadienne sat down, smiling, and announced the last day, asking if they were ready. Najin asked for a moment and questioned whether he could speak before the test. Ludica, annoyed, allowed him to speak. Najin shared his reasoning about the exam. The goal was to defeat a knight. Ludica turned to the students, asking who would be first. Fadienne, with a light smile, pointed out that what mattered was defeating her. Najin reflected that defeat didn't have to mean direct confrontation. Upon hearing the idea, Ludica turned her gaze to him, attentive. Nejin explained that the exam tested strength, not necessarily violence. Ludica reacted with a curious look. She remained silent, thinking. Despite that, Nejin and the others decided to face her in battle. Ludica and Fadienne observed the group, recognizing their determination. Fadienne, surprised, wondered what the plan would be. She figured Ludica was probably already annoyed. Ludica noted that some people grow stronger with anger. She finished by saying that others crumble without controlling their emotions. At that moment, Ludica understood the students' plan. She asked sarcastically if they believed they could defeat her in direct combat. The question sent a chill through the air, and Lucian shouted for them not to freeze in fear. Ludica approached, seen from below, wielding her sharp umbrella. In a swift movement, she launched herself at the students. Frightened, they reacted to stop the charge. Soon after, Ludica spun her umbrella in a threatening motion. The students watched her approach with apprehension. With a spin, she hurled the umbrella, a devastating move. The force knocked down several students, throwing one into the air. A student tried to shield himself, unable to open his eyes. Then he was surprised to see Ludica disappear. With a precise strike, she attacked Lucian. Shaken, he cried out that it was impossible to beat someone that strong. Najin replied that the plan to defeat her remained the same. 2 students, shocked, asked if he would use the same strategy. Calmly, Najin looked at one of them and explained. The plan was meant to interrupt her attacks. According to him, Lawson's ability had taken effect. The goal was simple: to allow Lawson to land a hit. Lawson stated it would work because Ludica was not on guard. Near her, he tightened his grip on the sword's handle. Ludica gave a piercing, focused stare. Immediately, Lawson felt a chilling shiver. Tyre said Ludica wasn't on guard. He explained that her gaze froze everyone, the biggest obstacle. He declared that even a 1-second opening could decide the battle. He concluded that such seconds couldn't be overcome with strength or courage. Suddenly, a powerful impact hit Lawson's chest, throwing him backward. Meanwhile, Ludica faced him directly. Ludica kept her eyes fixed, unwavering in the fight. On the other side, the student showed extreme effort. Ludica's eyes shone with intensity. At that moment, Najin calmly prepared to speak. Without hesitation, he quickly advanced toward Ludica. As he closed in, he declared that her gaze didn't affect him. With steady steps, he shortened the distance, ready for battle. Upon seeing him, Ludica recalled her suspicions about Najin, thinking he overestimated himself. With that, Ludica gripped the umbrella, determined to test the boy. Determined, she prepared her most powerful attack. A blow so destructive it would instantly kill Najin, but Najin would endure it. At the last moment, someone grabbed the umbrella, interrupting the strike. She was surprised to realize that Najin was Najin. Fadienne intervened, holding Ludica's umbrella. She declared she wouldn't allow Ludica to kill any student. In silence, Fadienne thought that Najin had used her and regretted stopping Ludica. She soon realized that by halting the attack, she increased Nejin's chances of winning because he was weak. Nejin clenched his teeth, red eyes fixed. Fedian watched with a serious, focused look. Ludica maintained total concentration. At that moment, she addressed the teacher, the white doe, while advancing with her spear. Angrily, she demanded that no one get in her way. Fedian launched a wave of energy with her hand. Even so, she kept her gaze steady, power radiating from her. As she pressed the attack, Ludica retreated, observed by Nejin. Inside, she wanted to see what he was capable of. Suddenly, an attack approached Nejin, who stared at it in surprise. Even so, Ludica kept her eyes fixed, determined. With sharpened focus, she continued to monitor the situation. Then she used her umbrella to deflect Fedian's attack. With that, the teacher fell to the ground with a heady impact. Right after, Ludica kept running. During the sprint, she asked why her opponent insisted. Staring at her, she asked if she was being challenged. In response, Fedian hesitated, thinking. As she scratched her head, unsure whether to tell the truth. After glancing at Nejin, she decided to say nothing. With a mysterious smile, she answered that it was a little secret. Furious, Ludica turned her gaze toward the teacher. Without revealing the reason, Fedian explained she couldn't say. She added that by fighting them, Ludica was also fighting the teacher. However, she clarified that all of it was merely an exam. With a serious expression, she concluded her reasoning. Then, she extended her hand and asked Ludica to admit defeat. Shocked, she questioned how she could have lost to those chicks. Serenely, Fedian confirmed with a smile. Irritated, Ludica turned her face, claiming it made no sense. Even so, the teacher insisted, while Lujin asked her not to provoke Ludica. Full of anger, Ludica clenched her teeth. Cautiously, Fedian stepped away, while Lujin shrank back in fear. Ludica wore a defeated expression, her eyes welling up. Seeing this, the teacher sighed, while Lujin looked at her in surprise. With a soft whimper, Ludica complained that she was being hindered. In a burst of emotion, she said she hated her, while the teacher encouraged her. 30 minutes later, Ludica congratulated everyone for passing. Immediately, the students reacted with surprise and excitement. Right after, she asked the new apprentices how they were feeling. In silence, Nejin remained thoughtful. Honestly, he replied that he didn't feel any different. Hearing that, Ludica explained that being a knight required dignity. Then she stated that the training would make them worthy. Right after, she called the chicks and demanded an answer. In front of her, the students assumed serious expressions. Then, with enthusiasm, they all responded. Next, someone's feet began to move. Soon after, a hand unsheathed a sword. At that moment, Nejin swung the blade. With a firm strike, he delivered a large slash. Determined, he kept his gaze fixed. Then he felt a tingling in his hand. Taking advantage of the momentum, he practiced the strike against a tree. While observing the field of stumps, he reflected on why he couldn't be like Nejin. Meanwhile, Ludica asked a student about the apprentice class. Unsure, he replied that it was the 274th, but she denied it. She then revealed that they all belonged to the second special class. She soon explained that a new system of special apprentices had been created. She added that within that class, everyone would serve directly in the knight's platoon. At that moment, Fedian warned them that they could die. However, Ludica pointed out that they were all weak and unarmed. Then she announced that the next task would be to track her. With determination, she emphasized that the deadline was 1 month. Resolute, she advised each one to find a weapon. Reflecting, Nejin believed he had already found his. Because of that, he realized he had been complacent. Even so, he concluded that he needed to train and improve. 2 weeks later, he was breathing heavily. Because of this, he cast a thoughtful look at the tree. Then he realized he wasn't making progress. 10 years ago, before the village fire, Nejin remembered Nejin being weak, needing his protection. One night, someone became very ill, coughing. Nejin was sick in bed, and his brother feared his end. Nejin said that seeing him ill made him decide to protect him forever. After days at death's door, Nejin began to recover. Then he glanced to the side, observing something. His red eyes reflected intense focus. Soon after, Nejin moved quickly, leaving a trail. In no time, he became unrecognizable in the field of chopped trees. In that short time, his brother had transformed. So he asked if Nejin felt better, because he'd never need protection again. Faced with that, he began to imagine. He thought that, if he tried, he could be as strong as Nejin, since they were twins. However, that didn't happen. So he regretted not being close to improving, feeling below average. Marks of effort were visible on a tree trunk. Even so, he wondered if it was possible, because he hadn't improved. He reflected on whether he lacked talent, and the answer was yes. To be more specific, in Nejin's case, it was different. He was a rare gem, a talent born once a century. Nejin, the opposite. Panting, he held the sword, searching his memory for something Nejin once said. He recalled his brother smiling, saying everything had to feel real. Then he sighed, realizing that practice didn't compare to reality. Soon he found himself before a massive stone wall. They say the trial by fire is the best way to learn. Thus, his hand trembled as it touched the rock, but he persisted. Right after, he gripped the stone tightly. Even while gasping, he fought to climb. However, he gave up, unable to scale the rocky wall. Afterward, he remained curled up, panting heavily. Meanwhile, he wondered how everyone had become so strong. Surprisingly, he noticed that the other students were skilled. Among them, Lawson was talented, and Neijin couldn't understand how he had become so strong. Neijin observed that Lawson disappeared every Monday, likely to train. Because of that, Neijin decided to copy his classmate's secret method. Soon after, Lawson looked back, apparently sensing something. The path ahead was empty and silent. At that moment, he wondered if Lawson had a sixth sense. He reflected to himself on what his classmate was looking at and that he should hurry. So he made a quick move, confirming his line of thought. Soon, Lawson dashed forward, vanishing. Meanwhile, he watched him run, surprised by the speed. In the end, he was panting, exhausted, trying to keep up. Trembling, Neijin lamented Lawson's speed, wondering if climbing wasn't the answer. Then he hid behind a tree, observing. Soon, Lawson appeared in front of a waterfall, wielding his sword. At that moment, he wondered if that was his chosen weapon. Then, Lawson swung the sword swiftly. As soon as he saw it, Neijin widened his eyes, realizing he was using the sword. Right after, Lawson performed a horizontal slash. With a single movement, he sliced the waterfall in half. Faced with that, Neijin was left speechless. Then he walked away, frustrated, thinking that it didn't help him. Amid those thoughts, he wondered if Lawson was strong and what kind of training he had done. Then Neijin found himself in a canyon with hooded figures. At that moment, one of the hooded figures stared at him. Soon he stood still, facing the group. Finally, he widened his eyes in confusion at the sight before him. Two hooded figures expressed confusion at their presence. Neijin asked if they had followed him, hearing something about a hippopotamus. Soon, he trembled, thinking about fighting, regretting he had forgotten his sword. Meanwhile, a hooded figure stared at him, and he felt cornered. Suddenly, he sensed a presence among the rock formations. Thus, he remained silent, thoughtful. Then his eyes widened as he wondered what to do. He was overtaken by panic, debating whether he should reveal his identity. At that moment, he was pulled from his thoughts and shouted Neijin's name furiously. Shortly after, Diamond Mask asked if he had been listening to the conversation. Meanwhile, the bandit leader restrained one of his companions. With that, Neijin's mind went into a frenzy. However, he was sure of one thing. They were confused too. He observed the body language of the hooded figures, noticing the confusion. Thus, Diamond Mask's question made Neijin realize they had been discussing something. He swallowed hard, and the solution came unexpectedly. In response, the hooded ones reacted with calculated silence. Then he gave a slight smile, trying to appear confident. Immediately, one of the hooded figures showed surprise. Next, everyone watched as a figure moved at high speed. Soon after, the bandit leader calmed his companion. At that moment, one hooded figure suggested attacking Neijin, but the leader warned him. Thus, the leader realized it was all a trap. The bandit chief had sharp instincts. Without evidence, they relied on the hunch that it was a setup. Under those circumstances, intuition was the best guess. However, the situation was a ruse, and Neijin wondered if the leader had fallen for it. He acted in the best way, implying a trap without saying a word. But from that experience, he gained something important. Soon, he kept a determined gaze, sweating. Then, Ludica advised Neijin to find weapons. He clenched his fist, thinking he had something valuable. Next, he declared he had his own weapon. Thus, he reflected that quick thinking had been his real weapon. Soon after, he looked upward, declaring that this was his weapon. At last, he remembered the professor, understanding that his strength came from being himself. Then Neijin ran at great speed. Suddenly, he was thrown to the ground by an invisible force. Soon, he pushed himself forward, sliding. With glowing eyes, he wondered if they had already caught up to him. Then, Lawson approached and called out to him with concern. He asked if he was alright and what he was doing there. Neijin sighed in relief upon seeing Lawson, but soon hesitated, suspicious. At that moment, his eyes widened as he reconsidered the facts. Then he wondered if Lawson could be Diamond Mask. Right after, he thought Lawson couldn't be Neijin. At that moment, Lawson asked what had happened to Neijin. Then he said, "Neijin, you," preparing to ask something. He wondered which question to ask. Soon after, Lujin arrived, out of breath. Lawson and Neijin saw Lujin arrive panting, saying they were in trouble. Suddenly, he shouted that the fox, Ludica, had disappeared. Thus, Neijin and Lawson exchanged confused looks, asking what had happened. Meanwhile, a wide view of the village was shown, silent. Then, the professor sarcastically asked if they really believed the 1-month deadline. Lujin and the other students reacted in shock. Soon, Ludica explained that the next task was to track her. At that moment, Lujin expressed his frustration with the professor about the timeline. Lujin voiced his annoyance, murmuring and clenching his fists. Thus, Tyre stated they should leave without delay, and Lujin suggested grabbing the essentials. Soon after, the professor asked about the weapons. Then she smiled and instructed them to sharpen their weapons. Neijin watched her seriously. Then he nodded in agreement. The professor smiled as if she already knew everything. Soon she asked if everyone was ready. Meanwhile, the group of students got ready. At last, Neijin felt his heart pounding, eyes locked ahead. One of the masked men asked if they were alright. Soon after, another asked if they shouldn't have gone after him. With that, one of them raised his hand, saying he would handle the situation. At that moment, the group fell silent. However, one of them said what was done was done. Then he asked if everyone was ready. Thus, the group of students prepared, and one of them exclaimed, "Time to go." Soon, Lawson announced he had found a trace of the night and pointed it out. Next, the others praised him, encouraging everyone to follow. With that, they all began walking along a trail toward a village. Meanwhile, a student commented on the tracks and asked everyone to stay alert. However, Najin merely watched in silence before asking if it was what the other thought. At that moment, Lujin looked at him confused. Then he questioned whether she had left the tracks by mistake, and his companion confirmed. Soon after, Najin asked if the knight would be that careless. Annoyed, Lujin exclaimed that there were tracks, wanting to know where he was going with it. Sighing, Najin explained that there was no guarantee of more clues. Next, a student wanted to know why he had sighed. Najin then asked whether she had done it on purpose. In response, the group stood still, watching the forest. Soon, he turned to Lawson and asked about the clues. However, he followed up by saying that, in fact, it was a sign. Furious, Lujin asked if that was a joke. Immediately, the other clarified that he hadn't said there wouldn't be one. He then added that the ideal would be to deduce the destination from the first clue. At that, the students exchanged glances. Soon, Lawson pointed to a map, explaining the clue to the east of the village. At that moment, Tyre wanted to know if everyone remembered the first time they saw her. An image of Ludica appeared in everyone's mind. Faced with that, he concluded that if she had been assigned to the north, there would be south and east. From that logic, Lawson concluded that the destination would be the center of the continent. Then Najin asked if the destination would be the capital. He continued explaining that the capital was the main place for knights. Finally, as night fell, the moonlight illuminated the forest. While the fire crackled, the students gathered. At that moment, Lujin complained about the exhaustion, but Lawson pointed out their progress. Then he asked Najin if they were ahead of Ludica. Soon after, he thought for a moment. Then he suggested that everyone share information about their weapons. He explained that this would help deal with the unexpected and strengthen their bond. At that, Lawson and another classmate agreed. Thus, he presented his sword, Libra, resistant to his techniques. Right after, Luce showed his axe, Twins, which emitted sparks. Next, Tyre displayed his unnamed dagger, which emitted concentrated sunlight. Then Lujin revealed his sword Lightning with incomparable sharpness. Curious, he asked Najin about his weapon. However, Najin remained seated, looking to the side. Then he replied that he needed to say something first. With a firm voice, he confessed that he was weak. He explained that he could never return to who he once was. The others watched him, surprised. He continued, saying what he was destined to become. He stated that he was no longer able to fight. Immediately, all eyes turned to him, perplexed. He revealed that he had realized this during the exam. As his body froze, he concluded that he should become the one who lost Najin. Internally, he thought his performance had been convincing. With compassion, Lawson comforted him, asking if he had been having difficulties. The truth was that the possibility of not being able to fight was significant. In reality, all of it was bait. Meanwhile, Lawson stared ahead with concern. Beside him, Lujin averted her gaze, thoughtful. On the other side, Tyre stared at the horizon, sweating. Luce, with a dirty face, also stared into the void. As the flames rose, someone called Najin for the watch. He replied that if anything was seen, he should be woken up immediately. Above them, the night sky continued to shine. Najin then got up and walked away from the fire. He kept walking, disappearing into the darkness. With footsteps and a soft rustling, someone questioned him. He replied that he was going to check for water or clues. In an attempt to argue, he began to answer but corrected himself. Then he heard the person ask if he was Najin. Najin returned a smile, as an intense red glow appeared in his eyes. At that moment, Najin remembered what he had said about no longer being able to fight. Even with doubts, no one could criticize someone who had lost their family. However, if they knew the truth about that day, the story would collapse. In that case, Nagin's words would reinforce the certainty that the survivor was him. That's why the bait had been a strategic move against Diamond Mask. It was at that moment that Najin realized who had taken the bait. Looking directly at the person, it was Luce. Thus, the two stood still in the forest. They continued staring at each other in silence. Meanwhile, Najin wondered if Luce was Diamond Mask, calculating distances. Even so, the other remained motionless. Najin stared at him, asking if he thought he was Najin. Soon after, he gave a furious look and asked if he was annoying him. At that, Luce trembled, startled. He commented that he thought he was Najin, but Najin would react like that. Faced with that, Najin thought the situation wouldn't be easy and asked if he was sure. While fiddling with something, Luce replied that it didn't matter because he was weak. Right after, he drew his weapon and revealed his goal, to kill him. Najin then smiled and with irony, asked how he planned to do that. Next, he made a quick move, but suddenly, his eyes widened in surprise. It was at that instant that Luce had launched himself and managed to hit him. The strike made Najin hold his wounded arm, realizing Luce's trick. In a cold tone, Luce warned that he wasn't the only special one. As he approached with the axe, he asked if Najin had shared what he heard. Najin, surprised, asked if he was referring to something from the past. At that moment, his memory revealed masked figures talking about the hippopotamus. With a serious expression, he became pensive. Right after, he smiled upon recalling two certainties after hearing Luce. Then he smiled darkly, stating that what had been said was important. Faced with his reaction, Luce trembled upon realizing Nagin's second certainty. Thus, he reaffirmed that he wasn't the only one who was special. That was when Nejin realized that Luz didn't know who he really was. With that, he pressed his lips together tightly, and at last he said just one word: ashes. At that moment, Nejin reminded him of his own words about the flame of Woodian. Despite that, the boy maintained a serious and focused gaze. That's when he heard the other add that he had been mistaken. He then firmly declared that it wasn't ashes, but embers. With growing anger, he promised he would keep burning until everything was incinerated. In response, Luz laughed and asked if he would really do that, and how. Without answering, he remained silent, holding his arm. Meanwhile, Luz watched him, uncertain. Soon after, Nejin took position, while the other firmly gripped his axes. Suddenly, an intense spark appeared on the ground. At the same moment, Nejin rushed forward, and Luz didn't move. Wielding one of the axes, he expressed surprise at the speed. Right after, he shouted for Lawson, Lucian, and Tyre. He quickly moved closer, startling the students. In response, Lawson and the others seemed shocked, asking what was going on. Already among the group, Luz approached, yelling that he was Nagyan, filled with fury. Out of control, he shouted and challenged everyone, claiming they were being deceived. Screaming, he declared that that wasn't a Jin, but Nejin. Continuing, he pointed at the young man in the center of the group. The students looked at each other, confused. At that, Luz let out a strange laugh. Nejin then shouted, telling him to stop. With sadness, he said he had tried to understand the other's confusion. With clenched fist, he said he should never have done that. Once again, Luz showed confusion. Even so, he kept his finger pointed at the other. With that, Lawson and the others seemed even more shocked. After all, there was something known as female intuition. That kind of perception allowed one to react to subtle cues. Soon after, Lucian, furious, questioned Luz's audacity. In response, he, surprised, asked if she really believed it. However, Nagyan's skill in building expressions interfered with intuition. At that moment, Luz widened his eyes, realizing something. Nagyan's true weapon wasn't just deceiving others. It was his remarkable ability to make people believe in him. Nagyan kept a serious look. Although the information didn't make sense, the students talked among themselves, and Luz seemed confused. Soon, some of them asked Nagyan if he was okay, and if he had gotten hurt. With that, the boy looked at him in shock, asking if he was really Najin. Meanwhile, a masked figure insisted she was sure it was Najin. However, another figure recalled what had happened, saying he had died. But the first corrected her, explaining they were never sure. The body was never found. Then one of them asked her companion what she thought, looking for support. However, the figure remained silent, reflecting on the possibility. Then she remembered the young boy's face. Next, the masked woman admitted that, by appearance alone, she was sure it was Najin. With that, the group fell silent in the clearing, surrounded by trees. Soon, one of them asked if they hadn't said they could tell them apart. Immediately, the other responded that yes, but now she wasn't so sure. Then she questioned whether they should believe what was said last week or now. She then tried to explain that Nagin could be pretending to be Najin. However, she emphasized that they couldn't be sure he was the son of fire. Thus, the figure explained that it was dangerous to act while both knights were nearby. Despite the tension, the scenery remained peaceful. Then Najin showed a surprised expression, his eyes glowing. Soon he stepped away from the group, walking through the forest. At that moment, one of the figures noticed something lifting her head. Meanwhile, Luz stood in shock, not knowing how to react. Shortly after, one figure scolded the boy, asking if he had been listening. With that remark, the two stared at each other intensely. Soon, Najin suspected that the person behind Diamond Mask was nearby. Then Najin challenged Luz to reveal his identity, stating that if he was wrong, then Luz should step forward. At the same time, another person shouted at the boy, demanding an explanation. With that, Luz grew thoughtful, unsure if he should deny the accusation. In the end, he wondered how he would explain his attempt to kill the person. Then he accepted that the other had already won, even if he didn't understand how. Immediately afterward, he quickly glanced to the side, searching for one last chance. While Najin remained nearby, he observed the figure from a short distance. Soon, he lunged with a small axe, surprising the other two. At that moment, Lawson blocked the attack with his sword, while Najin watched. With that, the attacker seemed irritated by the interruption. He spun the axe, ready to strike again. Tyre asked him if he really wanted to fight. At that moment, Lucian reflected, surprised by the speed he had shown. Meanwhile, Tyre observed the situation attentively. Soon, Lawson approached the attacker, explaining that he always fought with everything he had. With his sword raised, he prepared for battle, with Najin at his side. Then he stared at him firmly, stating that if he wanted to fight, he should be ready to fight to the death. In response, the other just watched him thoughtful. Even so, he accepted the situation, ready to act. Then he raised a knife, while the others watched in silence. At that moment, Tyre believed that this might be his. Soon after, he said goodbye to the group, saying he'd see them later. With that, a bright light exploded in the area. Thus, Najin slowly opened his eyes, revealing their red glow. Meanwhile, the four figures observed a sword embedded in the ground. The blade swayed slightly in place. Soon, a hand reached out to grab it. Next, the blonde student gripped it firmly. After a brief conversation, 3 of the 4 agreed to continue following the knight, but without him. At that moment, Najin commented that it had ruined the mood, but he liked the silence. The others remained quiet, Then Lujin caught his attention when she said his name. Soon after, she asked if he was okay, and he replied that he was. Even so, she tried to express herself, seeming worried. Then she encouraged him to keep his head up. Shortly after, the student quickly walked away from him. As he walked, Najin reflected on Lujin's group. Although he called them that for convenience, they only stuck together because of the classes. In that group, the attacker beat him up for fun. Tar, on the other hand, never hurt him, only observed. As for Lujin, she seemed to hate him, but didn't come across as a bad person. Now he understood her better. In that fire 10 years ago, the only victim had been, unfortunately, her father. So he silently watched the student. Meanwhile, Neijin felt a deep guilt for not having been able to save him. At that very moment, a red dot shone on the eastern coast of the continent. There, a sandy beach was bathed by relentless waves. Soon, a boat emerged from the water. Next, a person walked along the sand. That's when a mysterious figure, dressed in black, revealed themselves. Finally, she sensed a terrible smell, dense and metallic, while the rocky and desolate landscape stretched beneath a cloudy sky. The group leader said they should search for clues before moving on. Then he explained that the search required speed and range, setting the return time in 1 hour and instructing them to shout in case of emergency. With that, Lujin suggested that whoever found a clue would be exempt from night watch. Right after, the others ran off to start the search, leaving him behind. At that moment, he surveyed the area, preparing for his own investigation. Then he walked across the rocky terrain, examining the surroundings. Gradually, he continued at a slow pace, entering the landscape. Thus, he sat among the rocks, seeking a moment of rest. Next, he thought he could rest for an hour. Then he was grateful that it had been Luch who was the masked bandit, since no one liked him. At that moment, he recalled all the students who had been in Luce's group. With that, he considered the possibility that the problem didn't end with Luce. Even so, he refused to believe his own suspicion. Meanwhile, he remembered hooded figures commenting that he had been the one to block the attack. Soon, he reflected that the possibility of there being other bandits wasn't impossible, but the biggest problem was himself. Then he concluded that Luce was much stronger than he had expected, and that he himself was much weaker. Despite that, he recognized that he had accumulated a lot of strength, although there was still a large gap between him and the others. To him, it was a dynamic vision. At that moment, he realized he was completely unable to keep up with their movements. With that, he concluded that he needed to overcome that gap somehow. Even so, he thought that if his calculations were correct, he could buy some time. Meanwhile, Luce was running, visibly gasping. Soon, he stopped quickly upon reaching a location. Next, he stood still, resting after having run. Then he thought he had failed, but also learned something important. Suddenly, a shadow crept from behind a tree. Soon, a masked figure slid out from behind the tree, demanding that he reveal everything. Next, they asked if he was sure it was Neijin. Firmly, he replied that the statement made by him had convinced him of his identity. Thus, the masked figure agreed, thinking it made sense. Soon after, he suggested getting rid of him immediately. However, the figure replied that they couldn't do that while the other one was around. Then he asked who it was, but quickly concluded that if it was just Neijin, he wouldn't understand the plan. With that, they decided they would leak him for later. Meanwhile, Najin thought that now that he had time, he needed to figure out how to get stronger. Soon he realized that while trying to grow stronger, he would be protected by the knights. Shortly after, a student celebrated being the first to return, frightened upon seeing him already there. Nejin then said that everyone should report their findings. Lawson reported that he hadn't found anything, while Lujin shouted that she had an objection. Najin replied that he would hear complaints after everyone had reported, but the student insisted that her objection was about him being in charge. Lawson defended his companion, saying he was the strongest and the smartest. With that, Lujin admitted she couldn't argue with that, while Tyre said that if they kept arguing, she'd take a nap. Najin said it was fine and that Lujin was right, suggesting she become the new leader. With that, the student seemed to agree, although she still looked annoyed. Then he asked Lucian to report what she had found, and she replied that there was nothing special, while the other student grumbled that Nejin was still receiving the reports. Nejin then looked at Tyre, asking if she had found anything. She quickly confirmed her discovery, saying there was a small village nearby. He was surprised, wondering how Nejin knew before she even spoke. Meanwhile, Nejin remained silent and thoughtful. Then he suggested Lucian head to the village, and she agreed with a casual nod, while the other student grumbled again. The group's footsteps began to move, kicking up dust. Then they arrived at a ruined village, surrounded by a heavy silence. Lucian asked if that was really a village, seeing everything destroyed, and wanted to know how long ago it had been attacked. Najin suggested they split into pairs to search the area. He and Lucian agreed to look around. Lawson agreed, saying he'd see them soon, and left. The students began to spread out. A destroyed house had arrows embedded in its wall. An axe was lodged in the door of another building. Lucian asked about the state of the place, wanting to know if there were still any residents. He widened his eyes upon hearing a rustling sound. A sudden noise startled them both. Najin and Lucian looked at each other with intensity. A girl with pink hair, wearing torn clothes, appeared asking for help. She staggered, trying to say something about the villagers. Lucian held her, asking if she was alright. He then said the village seemed to have been attacked recently. Furious, he wanted to know who had done it. The girl, breathless, begged them to save the others. With that, Lujin widened her eyes. He reassured her, promising to help. She looked at Najin, still holding the girl in her arms. Soon, Lujin pointed to something, excitedly saying they had found a clue. The two of them looked back seriously. Then, Lawson and Lujin approached the collapsed girl, while Nejin and the other students stayed behind. Next, he asked the girl to tell them about the clue she had found. She then informed them that the clue was very recent, and if they left quickly, they might catch up to the person. With that, he seemed to understand the situation. Then, they looked back upon hearing the question of whether the girl was feeling better. So the girl explained that the village had been peaceful, but it was suddenly attacked a few days ago by them. At that moment, Lujin grew irritated and asked who the attackers were or what they were after. In response, she trembled and confessed that she had no idea. Then Najin asked what the attackers looked like and whether they wore masks. Right after, he observed her closely and reflected deeply on her words. Meanwhile, the girl replied that they didn't wear masks, but had their faces covered and carried strange weapons. Next, Tyre asked if she had seen anyone else pass by, describing someone with blue hair, an umbrella, and tear-shaped marks. However, she said she hadn't seen anyone like that. Still, she remembered that they were knight apprentices and pleaded for help. Attentively, they all listened to her plea, realizing the seriousness of the situation. Faced with this, Tyre suggested helping the girl, but Lujin questioned him, stating this was their chance to track Lady Fox. Even so, Tyre explained that even as apprentices, they couldn't ignore someone asking for help. In response, Lawson agreed, but pointed out that as apprentices, they might not have enough strength. He also added that the attack had been carried out by professionals. Then Lujin agreed about their lack of strength, but proposed that finding Lady Fox would solve the mission. Soon after, Lawson and Lujin asked why Najin was so quiet. With that, they called out to him, seeing that he seemed deep in thought. At that moment, Najin asked what would happen if they didn't find Lady Fox in time. Surprised, the three of them recalled that the clue was recent. Even so, he said he had one more question. In a serious tone, he asked what would happen if the ones who attacked the village were stronger than a knight. Finally, he added that, judging by the clue, the knight had passed through there. Even so, Tyre said he would fight them. Regardless of the enemy's strength, he declared they had to help those in need. Furthermore, he stated he'd rather choose that path than become a knight who turns his back. Faced with his words, Najin and Lawson watched him as he stood firm. With that, Lawson said he would go find Lady Fox. Soon after, Luzin, sweating and visibly nervous, stammered that she would go too. Then Tyre asked Najin what he would do. In silence, he stared at his two companions, keeping a serious expression. After reflecting on what would be the best course of action, he stated that he would act. Soon, his steps indicated that he was beginning to move. At that moment, the young woman informed them that there was a large cave halfway up the mountain. Thus, the boy came upon the cave entrance and asked if that was the place. Meanwhile, with a worried expression, he questioned if he was sure about what they were doing. In response, Najin drew his sword and stared at him with determination. Calmly, he said there was no problem in moving forward. Carefully, Tyre watched him, thoughtful. At last he gave in, agreeing with the decision. Then both decided to enter the cave. Soon, they continued their steps, moving into the darkness. Suddenly, a large explosion echoed from outside. With force, the blast spread a cloud of smoke through the forest. Above, the young woman in the tree lamented what had happened. From her position, she realized only two of them had fallen into the trap. With that, she observed from the tree, resigned. Meanwhile, inside the cave, the place proved vast. Both continued walking, noticing how huge and strangely silent the environment was. Suddenly, Tyre became alert, sensing something. In the distance, a mysterious figure was seen sitting deep in the cave. Cautiously, he signaled for silence and pointed at the figure. At that moment, the two and a masked man watched the scene, asking what it was. In shock, Tyre's eyes widened. Thus, Najin's red eyes also opened, surprised. Next, a quick and precise attack shot through the darkness. Immediately, Tyre struck back with a blow, creating a shockwave. At that same instant, the masked man appeared behind the boy. Then Tyre joined Najin, who already had his sword drawn. Soon, the masked man asked if they were intruders or guests. At that moment, Najin realized that the attacker was not the masked bandit they were expecting. The man turned to them, while Tyre called out the name of the companion who was watching. Seriously, he stated that the situation was bad because the individual was as strong as a knight. Faced with that, the masked man showed curiosity as he observed them. Then Tyre asked Najin to use his intelligence to come up with a strategy. Panting, he suggested that first they needed to think about how to hold out. Bending slightly, the masked man asked about the knight. Immediately, both of their eyes widened. Then the masked man lifted an object, asking if the knight they were looking for was Rosewood Fox. With eyes wide open, Najin recognized her umbrella and realized Tyre had been right. Then Lujin expressed that they should also search for Lady Fox, her voice filled with urgency. With that, she said they didn't know when they'd have another chance to find her, and Tyre confirmed that he was determined. Then both looked ahead seriously. Soon, Tyre suggested they split into pairs. Two would search for Lady Fox, while the other two would help the villagers. Firmly, Lawson promised they would find her and bring her back as soon as possible. asking them not to fight alone. Even so, Tyre replied that they didn't need to worry because he was sure they could handle it. However, he thought to himself that the opponent was as strong as a knight. At that moment, the masked man was holding an umbrella. For a brief moment, the bandaged face let out a sinister smile. Soon, Lujin looked back with a worried expression. Then, Lawson asked what was bothering her, and she asked if they would be okay. With that, she looked toward the entrance of a cave in the distance. The dark and imposing opening of the place seemed to conceal something ominous. Inside it, a battle was already underway between the three figures. At that moment, the bandaged figure gripped the umbrella handle tightly. Meanwhile, Tyre held his own item firmly. Suddenly, someone asked the masked man if he had done it. Then Najin asked if he had attacked and hurt the villagers. Without hesitation, the masked man confirmed that he had and challenged him to show what he had. With that, Najin concluded that now they had confirmation and realized he needed to buy time. Then he thought through a plan, considering that it was just him and Tyre there. Additionally, he remembered that Tyre's weapon could create a single flash of light. Thus, he began scanning the environment closely and concluded that he already knew the best option. At that moment, the masked man squeezed the umbrella even tighter. Quickly, Najin alerted Tyre that the attack was coming and ordered him to block it. Then he deflected the blow coming toward his face by hurling the umbrella at the ceiling. Right after, the man appeared before him with a strike ready. Even so, he kept his gaze steady and determined. In the next moment, the masked figure spun and hurled him with movements as fast as they were deadly. The body flew past Najin before he could react, crashing into the wall. Right after the impact, Tyre expressed determination to continue the fight. In response, Najin, eyes glowing red, looked forward and called out to Tyre. At that same moment, the enemy's heavy foot struck the ground with force. Then, the masked one readied his sword and quickly prepared to charge at them. Without warning, he dashed at high speed toward his target. Ready, Tyre positioned himself for the collision as the dust rose. With a worried expression, Najin expressed his denial. He then thought that if Tyre were incapacitated, their chances would be zero, so the masked man thought that, in that case, he would rather take action himself. Najin and Tyre then joined forces as he activated an ability, synchronizing their movements. Soon, a light shone in the darkness, and someone asked if the target had fainted. Thus, Najin saw Tyre standing and relieved, affirmed that he was fine. Shortly after, Tyre called Najin, trying to wake him up and asking if he was alright. With effort, he confirmed that he was. Then he turned to Tyre, one eye glowing intensely, and asked if he had used the ability. Tyre explained that he had no choice and needed to protect him while he was unconscious. Hearing that, Najin felt his body numb and muttered that without his companion's weapon, they couldn't win. He then widened his eyes upon realizing they had no real chances. Soon, he regained clear vision, while the masked man mocked them. Even so, the boy concluded that even if he wanted to strike, there was no opening. Threateningly, the masked man stated they shouldn't worry. Then he finished the sentence, revealing that they never had a chance as he delivered a blow. With resolve, Najin gripped the weapon in his hand. At that moment, Tyre looked on in despair and asked if this was the end. Najin wondered if this was really how they would fail. Right after, the masked figure was hit directly by a slashing strike and pulled back. Immediately, the two looked up, surprised by the sudden interference. Suddenly, a dagger flew through the air at high speed. With precision, Lujin caught it and apologized. He explained they had decided to come, even if it meant losing Lady Falk. Next, a voice murmured that they needed to save the others, so Lujin explained they simply couldn't leave them behind. Then Najin and Tyre exchanged glances and smiled at each other. Soon he closed his eyes for a moment satisfied. Thus, he and his friends Lawson and Lujin joined Tyre, who confirmed he was alright. Suddenly, the masked figure moved, raising a cloud of dust. Finally, Najin panted and declared that it was time to show the enemy what they were capable of. The hooded and bandaged figure stood before them, unmoving. Soon, Najin and the students stared at him seriously. In response, the figure seemed to gaze back with glowing eyes. Then the figure shifted position, and the ground beneath his feet cracked. As soon as he realized, Najin widened his eyes. Next, a cloud of dust signaled the figure had vanished. Then he shouted that they were coming and asked Luzin to block them. She rose and defended the strike with her sword. Even so, she felt the strong impact of the attack, leaving her dazed. However, Najin warned her not to let her guard down, as they were as strong as knights. Soon she looked at her companion, surprised by his brute strength and speed. Meanwhile, he thought that, as expected, he couldn't see the attack, but he could feel it. Though unable to track the movement with his eyes, he sensed the assault came from a subtle shift in weight. At that, he asked Tyre how he was feeling, and Tyre replied that he was as strong as ever. Najin then confronted him, asking him to be honest and not act out of pride. So Tyre thought for a moment, his eyes serious. Soon after, he admitted he was at his limit and couldn't move his body. Najin then called Lawson, who immediately approached. The masked figure raised his sword before the students. At that moment, he stated that Tyre was injured and that they would move forward alone, with Lujin and Lawson agreeing. Then, a nearby rock began to crack near the masked figure. Soon, the cracked rock dropped toward the ground. However, it floated in the air between them. After that, it shattered as it touched the ground. The hooded figure then raised his arm as Lawson and another student launched their attack. At the same time, he made a quick motion with his arm, dodging the strikes. He noticed Lujin and Lawson approaching from opposite sides. The masked man then realized their goal was to surround him. Meanwhile, Nejin stood before him, with the other students completing the trap. With that, the hooded figure reacted with a swift movement. Then he declared he only needed to take down the leader. Right after, Tyre suddenly appeared behind the leader. Even so, Nejin repeated that he needed to be direct. With that, he struck the hooded figure. The impact was so strong that the hooded figure's sword got stuck in the ceiling. He realized he had been cornered in a narrow space. Nejin and Tyre attacked from above, targeting blind spots. Meanwhile, Lujin and Lawson charged from below. With a smile, the hooded figure reacted to the attack. Then he questioned what their plan was while attacking Tyre. Next, he threw the boy far away. Soon after, he landed a precise blow to Lujin's stomach. With the impact, she was neutralized. Thus, he left her behind as she fell and vanished at high speed. At that moment, Lawson watched the scene in shock, while the hooded figure was already behind him. Then he tried to defend himself from a quick attack. As a result, he was hit and fell to the ground. In response, the hooded figure raised his head and declared he was the last one. Then he claimed that no soul had ever gone without telling a lie. He went on to explain that an anxious pulse, suppressed speech, and subtle movements were revealing signs. Even so, he added that a perceptive person could notice these signs. However, he revealed that such signs didn't apply to Negan and asked if Luce was trying to provoke him. After that, he continued saying that Negan didn't show any of those signs. Meanwhile, Najin felt a tear fall and called himself a knight. Then the hooded figure watched him cry, understanding what was missing in the truth. Soon, Ludica was seen crying, and that was seen as the truth behind her strength. Next, the hooded figure felt a strong impact and questioned whether he was really that strong. With that, he realized Negan hadn't truly grown stronger. However, he concluded that the higher the level, the more sensitive they became to this type of illusion. For that reason, he said they would have to remain on guard, as Lawson clenched his fist. Soon after, he made a swift hand movement. Thus, Najin watched everything closely, his red eyes glowing. The hooded figure raised a hand wrapped in bandages and made a swift motion toward Lawson. Then, Lawson watched everything with a shocked expression, his green eyes wide open. With that, a dark blur sped past, revealing a sudden opening in space. Next, he was thrown into the void, while Najin remained still, sword in hand. After that, Lawson landed forcefully, dragging his blade into the ground beside his comrade. At that moment, Nejin's red eye glowed intensely. Soon after, he felt cold sweat drip down his face, showing the immense effort it required. Even so, he kept gasping, eyes still fixed on the hooded figure in front of him. Then he admitted he still wasn't used to it, and that he had reached his limit. Meanwhile, the opponent watched him closely, wondering if he had returned to normal. Then he smiled and said he liked their fighting spirit, but that he still needed to eliminate them. With that, Najin, Lawson, Tyre, and Lujin, all gasping for air, stared at him silently, exhausted. Then the hooded figure offered a chance, proposing they work for him. Faced with that, the students looked at each other, surprised by the unexpected proposal. At that moment, Lujin reacted, asking what he meant by that. Then he stated that anyone who didn't want to could leave, warning he would count to 3. But he added that anyone who didn't choose a side by the end of the count would meet their end. With that, Lawson showed concern, his face sweaty and eyes wide. Next, Lujin started the count, saying 1. Soon after, Tyre watched silently, his face damp with sweat and his gaze lowered. Meanwhile, Najin questioned if that was really happening, concluding that the real problem was the lack of choice. At that point, Lujin, voice shaking, agreed that they had no choice and that they were weak. Even so, she continued, saying to Tyre that even together, they wouldn't stand a chance. Then Nejin expressed concern, asking if she was thinking of giving up. At that moment, his hand still gripping the sword visibly trembled. Next, the hooded figure continued the count, saying 2. Then he narrowed his red eyes, his sweaty face showing anguish. As he gripped the sword hilt tightly, Lujin made her decision. Even so, she continued firmly, saying they had to fight, because that was the way. She confessed she was afraid to die, but reminded them they were knight trainees. Nejin clenched his face, shaken by the situation. With that, Lujin shouted at the hooded figure that their path would go through him. Then Najin praised her for her attitude. Soon after, the masked figure finished the count and charged to attack. As he was almost struck, Najin closed his eyes. Even so, he opened them again, and his red gaze shone with determination. At that moment, Ludica appeared from above, observing the scene with an umbrella in hand. She said she was fine and praised the group, stating they had done a good job. However, she declared that she couldn't accept the situation as it was. At that moment, Professor Fedian smiled at her in silence. Then, turning to the other woman, Ludica stated that it was unacceptable to let them proceed. In response, Fedian looked at her seriously and firmly. Soon, Ludica directly asked if the intention was to kill them. Fedian replied that she disqualified anyone who wasn't up to the challenge. With that, Ludica agreed, saying she would test them in her own way. Right after, she declared that anyone who didn't meet her standards would be sent home. Then she turned to the 4 students and repeated that they had done a good job. At that, Tyre was surprised to see her and asked if she was okay. Instead, Ludica expressed great disappointment with the group, contradicting her earlier reaction. In response, Tyre looked at her, confused by the change in tone. Meanwhile, Najin reflected that their approach had been a decent method. Even so, Ludica added that it would have been more impressive if they had actually found her. Hearing that, Najin and Lujin reacted with surprise. Then, Ludica revealed that she had been circling around them. The four of them were shocked by the unexpected revelation. She continued, saying there were more disappointments, as they had all performed terribly. At that moment, the students looked at her in silence, not understanding. However, Ludica pointed out that even when faced with an unbeatable enemy, they hadn't given in and acted properly. Still, the students remained confused. Even so, she concluded that this was the true virtue of knighthood. Previously, Tyre had declared he preferred to follow the path of the knight. Then, Ludica praised his attitude, saying she would award points for that. For that reason, she declared all four of them official knight apprentices and gave her approval. Right after, she praised Lujin for his courage. Then Ludica warned Tyre that being determined was good, but he shouldn't be carried away by absolute certainty, and he nodded. She then turned her gaze to Najin, saying she had many questions for him. At that moment, she asked if he had known something from the beginning. Seriously, Najin replied that he had. Soon, Ludica asked since when he knew and why he hadn't warned his teammates. With that, he stared at her with a serious and determined expression. While pieces of ribbon came loose and fell to the ground, the hooded figure, now revealed as Fidorance, complained that he had almost suffocated with all of it. Lawson, Tyre, and Lujin watched him, still visibly confused. Soon, Fidorance looked at them with a subtle smile. Then Tyre, surprised, realized that Fidorance was a knight and concluded that it had all been a test. Fidorance grumbled again, saying that Ludica had forced him to participate. Even so, he commented that he didn't understand why Ludica and Fadian were taking so long. At that moment, Tyre and Lujin, still shocked, asked if he was really the Periwinkle wild dog. Fidorance confirmed with excitement and wanted to know what they wanted to ask. Then Lujin stepped in, saying there was something he still didn't understand. He soon asked Fidorance about the supposed village invasion. Next, he questioned how a knight could do something so cruel. In response, the three students looked at each other in silence, but Fidorance remained quiet. At that moment, Ludica called out to Luce with a serious expression. Najin watched her in silence with a thoughtful look. Meanwhile, he reflected that the question was loaded and that Ludica seemed to be trying to extract information. Even without knowing exactly what she knew, he concluded that he just needed to dodge the question. With that, Ludica observed and looked confused at the answer she heard. Soon, Najin explained that Luce had intentionally separated from them. Then, Ludica reflected on what he said, but decided that since Luce had given up, all of them would be disqualified. She then returned to the main topic, asking when Najin had realized the situation. Najin began to explain that he had noticed several signs, such as the woman who said the villagers had been killed. However, he noticed there was no blood among the village debris. Meanwhile, Ludica observed him closely, in silence. Najin also reflected that the villager had lost credibility when she mentioned the group of 5. Thus, he concluded it was all a trap or a test. Even with all of that, Ludica repeated the question. Why didn't he warn his teammates? Najin replied that he wasn't sure. Then she wanted to know why he had gone along with the group. With resolve, Najin declared that he came precisely to be sure, and now he was. Then Ludica asked what his proof was. Najin pointed to her umbrella, explaining that their encounter had been face to face. Furthermore, he said it was hard to believe in a real fight, since the object wasn't damaged. He said that when he faced her, he knew Ludica would never go down without leaving clear marks. At that moment, he became certain that everything was part of a test orchestrated by her. Even with the explanation, Ludica kept her gaze firm and piercing. Najin then murmured that such certainty proved it was a lie. Meanwhile, Najin remembered the strange feeling he had when meeting the villager. Soon he was sure they were all acting, especially after seeing the bandaged fighter. With that, he explained that he had hidden what he knew precisely to help his companions fight and grow. Even so, Ludica replied that she didn't believe that justification. She considered that both Najin's analysis and attitude were far beyond expectations. Faced with that, he watched her in silence, without backing down. Ludica continued, also commenting on the power he had shown. Then she thanked him for the details and stated that now she could finally speak. She then declared that she didn't like him or his presence at all. She went on to say she couldn't ignore that he had used his comrades and that his behavior was far from honorable. As she walked away, she stated she'd be watching him all the time. Moving forward, she called the group to continue ahead. Right away, Najin thought that this was not good for him and was almost regretting his actions. In the next moment, Lujin asked him not to worry because it was just a test. Now with everyone outside, Fidorance complained that it had been a while since she had breathed fresh air, and at that moment, Ludica told her to stop whining. Curious, Tyre asked where they were heading now, and in response, Ludica said they were in search of the second special class. Surprised, Najin was shocked by her boldness in saying they were already late. For a moment, the supervisor paused when she heard a voice saying there was no need to look for them. Up in the trees, the instructor from the other group said they were the ones who were late. One of them asked to hurry up, and the other replied for him to slow down instead. Watching the entire scene, Ludica said nothing but observed everything. Soon, all the other students were present and also panting. Finally, Lucian, surprised, expressed mild recognition. Then, one of the students with sea green hair noticed something. She quickly charged toward all the students from the other class. Faced with that, Nejin stared at her, completely shocked. Soon, Tyre remarked that she was way too fast. Next, the woman prepared a new attack with her hand. Frightened, Najin lamented the situation, not understanding what was happening. At the same time, he wondered if she was part of the masked group. Even so, out of nowhere, she extended her hand toward him. Then the woman got ready for a handshake. However, she called Najin by his full name and greeted him. Immediately, Najin widened his eyes in total shock. Soon after, she smiled gently. Still not understanding, Najin thought the situation was turning bad. Then, a hand opened, palm facing upward. Meanwhile, he observed the gesture with his red eyes fixed. With that, Zeus identified him by his spiky hair, and Black Hen Warren asked if that was the prodigy. Right after, Sky Blue Raccoon Durang asked his companion what he thought of him, and the latter admitted he wasn't sure about his strength. Then some apprentices from Myeok in the east questioned the presence of 4 people, expressing frustration over their previous defeat. Next, 2 apprentices from Fergil spoke up. Noljan commented that he didn't look strong, while Yolnia praised him, saying he seemed more powerful than expected. Soon after, Paimel, an apprentice from Latun, asked Lyman if the newcomers didn't seem strong, but she told him to hush, promising not to say anything else. Then, a group of apprentices from Latinsia wanted to know if that man was the youth from Woodian, and one of them observed that Marcia had never been that kind to anyone. Meanwhile, she smiled with a peculiar expression on her face. With all the attention on him, he began to feel uncomfortable with the excessive staring. Thus, he recognized that in that situation, he had no other choice. Soon, he decided to rely on his old boldness, since he couldn't remember anyone around him. Meanwhile, she kept watching with a serious expression on her face. Then he concluded that it was better to act that way than to pretend he knew her. With that, Musa furiously scolded him for speaking to Marcia like that. Even so, he reflected that she was the most anticipated knight in training. Soon, she smiled and asked if he had forgotten her, and even hinted he had forgotten something else. Next, she recalled the promise they had made, that they would have a child together and raise him to be the strongest knight when both became knights. With that, he and the other students looked shocked, and one of them didn't hesitate to ask what was going on. Then Lucian confronted him about his actions, but he denied everything, being accused of deciding it all on his own. Even with his eyes fixed on the speaker, he firmly stated that he would never agree to something like that. Then she turned her gaze to the side, her yellow eyes shining intensely. Despite showing some shyness, she insisted that he surely remembered. Soon he made a grimace, saying he didn't associate with trivial people and suggested she become the strongest knight on her own. After that, he took a few steps forward, walking past everyone present. Meanwhile, Marcia watched the scene with a surprised expression. Next, Lucian grabbed his arm, complaining about what he had said, but was reassured when she heard that he was always like that. Right after, she punched him hard, making him step back. Then he stepped back with his heart pounding, feeling watched by Marcia. Soon after, she, with a furious expression, ordered them not to touch her. She then walked a few steps away from the group. Meanwhile, Lucian, still with her heart racing, asked what was going on with her. Later, Ludica and Fidorenz commented that Marcia and Najin were getting along well, although one of them reacted with indifference. Thus, Zeus introduced himself as a knight. He then explained the theory of knighthood to all the apprentices gathered in the village. With that, he pointed at those present and called them idiots, which prompted someone to tell him to shut up. Then Lucian, surprised, asked if knights really needed theory, and heard an invitation to raise their hand if they thought the same. Soon, she began to slowly lift her hand. However, he looked at her seriously and declared that anyone who did that was not fit to be a knight. Immediately, she flinched and lowered her hand. In response, other students also recoiled as the knight began telling the story of the spear and the shield, involving a weapon merchant. Thus, the merchant displayed a spear, claiming it could pierce anything. Next, she showed a shield, saying it was impenetrable and could stop any weapon. Soon after, an observer asked what would happen if the spear was used against the shield. The merchant then fell silent, unable to answer. With that, Zeus asked what the story made them think, addressing the green-haired girl who had raised her hand. At that moment, Lucian hesitated, suggesting that one shouldn't deceive people, and then asked if she should be honest. Meanwhile, 2 students beside her laughed and showed irritation at her answer. Then he asked the girl's name, ignoring the laughter around them. Soon, she blushed and said her name, being praised for her answers, simple but courageous. Next, he explained that the story shows how even the most powerful weapons are useless without the ability to persuade. Furthermore, he continued, saying that strength alone doesn't define a knight, and that the strongest cannot lead without knowing how to convince others. Thus, he stated that a knight needs a convincing sense of justice. Then he turned to the black-haired student who had laughed at Lucian and asked what he thought of the story. With some hesitation, the boy replied that one needed to be persuasive and passed the question to the blonde student. Then, the blonde student said that strength alone meant nothing, and that a knight needed common sense to lead. Next, Zeus asked Najin what he thought upon hearing the story. Soon, he became the center of attention, with a glow surrounding him. Then he thought for a moment and declared that the shield would be the better choice. With that, the two students beside him looked confused, questioning what he was saying. So the knight asked him to continue, wanting to know exactly what he meant. At that moment, he explained that if both were the best in their categories and made of the same material, he would choose the shield. Soon after, a spear struck a shield with a brilliant glow. Meanwhile, other students looked at him confused, not understanding what he meant. Then Zeus smiled, saying he had never heard such an interpretation, and said he simply wanted to hear their opinions. Next, he explained that he wished to hear everyone's interpretations and thoughts, emphasizing that acting on one's own, without external influence, is justice. Then he reprimanded the two students for simply repeating his words and for laughing at Lucian, who at least expressed her own opinion. Firmly, he warned them not to mock others' ways of thinking, for there is not only one right way to see things. Soon, a hand rose in the air. At that moment, Black Hen Warren appeared with a spear, claiming that it too could pierce anything, and the knight asked what the point of that was. In response, she said she was joking and suggested ending the lecture, so everyone could rest before the trials. Surprised, Najin asked about the so-called tests. Casually, Warren explained that they would engage in duels with each other to evaluate their skills. Finally, he asked if that sounded fun. Thus, he and Lucian swallowed hard, observing the situation. Then, a character lifted a technological mask. The blue crystal on it glowed intensely. Right after, the glow quickly faded. Soon, the person put it on their face. He then asked if the other masked one was ready, and he confirmed yes. Even so, he asked who the character representing danger was. While showing confusion, his companion recalled the mentioned risk and asked who he meant. With that, he answered that it was the fox. Soon, the masked one showed surprise upon hearing the name. With a serious expression, he confirmed the information about who she was. As soon as the man explained that she had been watching them since they left Woodian, the other listened carefully. With that, he warned that it wasn't just her. Other knights were also on the way, one of them especially problematic. Then he advised avoiding them, and when asked who was so feared, he began to reveal the name. Next, a pink-haired girl announced it was time to draw the straws. While one student picked his, another gasped in surprise, recognizing her as the villager from before. Soon, Ludica revealed that she worked for the knight's administrative office, startling one of the students. The girl regretted having made a fatal mistake after being informed of 5 knights, though one had escaped. With that, the students reacted with surprise to the news. One of them held a straw with a red tip and noticed the color. Lucian lifted hers and asked if she had won. Ludica explained that the fight would be between those who drew the same color, and that there would be no winners, making the girl uncomfortable. As someone approached and asked if she had drawn red, she confirmed. Wadrin, who also drew red, laughed and considered himself the winner, while another student showed envy. Lucian accepted the acknowledgement, confused, thinking Ludica had said there were no victories. Then Tyre whispered to her, warning that they were making a fool of her and she shouldn't pity him. She showed a confused expression. Her blue eyes shone intensely. Furious, she warned she would attack with all her strength. Then the screen showed that she and Wadrin had been drawn for the match. Soon after, Quering and Nulgen were shown as the next pair. Najin and Yolnia appear as the following ones. Next, Tyre and Marcia were announced as the next duo. Soon after, Musa and Torison were to prepare for combat. Lawson and Daragon were revealed as the next to face off. Thus, Paimel and Jarun were shown as the next pair. Finally, Viel and Lyman were the last ones displayed. With that, Black Hen Warren shuffled the straws and announced the start of the duels. He pulled one and revealed that the drawn color was red. With a mocking smile, Wadrin called the 2 red straw students to the front. Lucian stepped forward seriously, taking position beside him. They faced each other in the center, under Black Hen Warren's watchful gaze. He asked if they intended to fight unarmed, surprising them. Then he shouted for someone to toss them weapons. Wadrin quickly grabbed the one thrown toward him. Lucian also caught the one tossed to her. Warren instructed Wadrin to try to kill her. Soon, he charged and attacked her with the weapon, catching her off guard. With a metallic sound, the blows clashed in the air. She was startled to see Warren intervene with a spear between them. He showed a scratch on the blade, explaining that the fight only ends with a knight's intervention, encouraging them to fight to the death. The other students reacted in shock, understanding the true limit of the combat. Lucian and Wadrin stared at each other with determination. Warren raised his weapon and announced the beginning of the fight. As soon as the battle started, both charged quickly. Wadrin landed a direct kick to her face. Lucian's eyes widened from the impact. She slid across the ground, her weapon rolling beside her. With a tense face, she realized her opponent's strength and questioned whether she could win. Without delay, he attacked her with another kick. This time, the blow hit her head. Right after, he prepared to land a punch. The impact struck her face directly. Fallen to the ground, Lucian received another blow to her body. She showed pain and surprise, her face already marked. Fitterance watched the fight, noting how Wadrin was completely dominating and overwhelming her. With force, he struck her again, throwing her against the ground. As Wadrin continued the assault, Fitarance noticed something strange. The boy leaned over her as she lay on the ground and smiled mockingly. Lawson watched closely and noticed he wasn't using the weapon. Another student with disdain ignored the scene while clenching his fist, silently agreeing with the discomfort. Tyre commented angrily that he was doing it on purpose. Even injured, with determined eyes, Lujin realized he was dragging out the fight. Then Tyre muttered that Wadron was just playing with her. Nejin's red eyes locked onto the scene, showing an intense reaction. Then Fadian said she was worried about Lucian, though she didn't consider her weak. However, she explained that in power, speed, or intelligence, she wasn't better than anyone. With that, she advised her to always improve her own strength. Suddenly, the girl felt a strong impact on her face. Then her eye glowed intensely, so she gripped her sword tightly, thinking she didn't know her own strength, but she didn't want to lose either. With a shout, she attacked with her sword, showing she didn't want to lose. Meanwhile, Luce complained about being bored and tired of the training, wanting something fun. He soon widened his eyes and said he found something fun. At that moment, Najin was walking down the street, surrounded by others passing by on the same path. Curiously, Luce and Lucian watched him, the former wondering how to provoke him, while the latter just murmured Nagin's name. Suddenly, a hand emerged from intense flames, with someone desperately calling out for their father trapped in the fire. Lucian gritted her teeth at the sight. Then Lucian shoved Luce aside, and with an idea, ran off in a hurry. Right after, Nejin was struck directly. Soon after, she confronted him, demanding he reveal the reason for his actions. Meanwhile, Luce yawned, finding the situation repetitive, and Tyre just watched. The boy's eyes were glowing intensely. With a raised voice, the girl continued asking why he had started the fire and why her father had to die. She also questioned whether her father had done anything wrong, yet he kept his gaze steady. Even so, he remained silent. In frustration, he stated that he didn't know the answer. At that moment, Lucian yawned again, realizing the other would only repeat the same response and wouldn't give her a reason. Furious, the girl asked what she was supposed to blame then. Meanwhile, Nejin stayed leaning against the wall, wearing a tired expression. Suddenly, the scene shifted back to the present, with him watching the fight between the girl and Wadron. Around them, several students watched the scene, closely following what was happening. Then Musa and Marcia were watching too, the latter appearing serious. Next, a bloodied hand dripped onto the ground, marking the boy's cowardice. Wadron was breathing heavily, clearly gasping for air. Soon after, Lucian, sweaty and panting, stood with her sword in hand and her mouth open in effort. She clenched her teeth, her face twisted in exhaustion and anger. Meanwhile, Ludica began walking away, saying she didn't want to take part in Waren's twisted games, while someone else questioned her departure. Zeus, turning to Black Hen Waren, asked if he wouldn't intervene, wondering if the evaluation hadn't already been enough. Calmly, he replied that the girl was holding up well and asked if she wasn't curious about her own limits. Right after, Zeus immediately interrupted him, declaring that it was enough with a serious expression. At that moment, Black Hen Waren moved slightly. Then he let out a small laugh. Meanwhile, Wadron continued gasping, visibly tired of the situation. Likewise, Lucian remained breathless with a strained expression. Then she raised her hand, panting, as if trying to gather herself. Wadron reacted in surprise, realizing she was still standing. Suddenly, a hand grabbed the boy's wrist. At that moment, Black Hen Waren held the young man's wrist, declaring the end and Wadron's victory. In the end, the two shook hands. Then Wadron asked if her name was Lupia, and the girl corrected him with the right name. Next, the student confronted her, telling her to give up being a knight because she was weak. Soon after, she was shocked to hear that the special class would go on missions, and in her current state, she'd get herself killed and put her comrades at risk too. Finally, he asked if it wasn't shameful to want to be a knight with that level of strength. Still, she, with her eyes fixed, declared that it was for herself and for the others. Meanwhile, the student walked away. Right after, he mocked the girl's effort, asking if everyone from Woodian was weak and if they only passed because of Nejin. Indignant, Lawson and Tyre commented that that was too much, knowing she wouldn't endure such provocation with her pride. At that moment, she staggered toward Lawson, who asked if she was okay. Then the girl closed her eyes briefly. Next, she laughed, admitting she had been defeated, and asked him to win for her. With a serious expression, Nejin remained silent. Soon she said she needed to sit down and rest a bit. Meanwhile, the students watched her, thinking she looked better than expected and that she had matured. Thus, Nejin remained silent, alert. Soon after, a hand spun a stick, announcing the next match, Yolnia versus Najin. Casually, Black Hen Waren stated that the rules were the same and that he expected to see Najin's abilities, the rising star. At that moment, he thought Nagin intended to give up, since he would never win a match like that and his lack of skill would be exposed. However, Waren mocked the idea that he was about to give up the fight. Then he asked what he had said. Still, the boy thought Lucian was weak and had always been. In addition, he reflected that, although she seemed headstrong, she tried to hide her emotions at crucial moments. That's why he always pretended to ignore it. Meanwhile, the young woman cried, and he thought it didn't matter. It was just her. At that moment, Yolnia asked what he meant. Still, the voice in his mind continued, saying he should take advantage of the situation, given the way he'd been provoked. Soon, he concluded that, somehow, Nagyan was a bit irritated. Thus, with red eyes, he challenged the trainees to attack, saying he would face them alone. Surprised, Yolnia widened her eyes. With that, the other students also watched, shocked. Even so, he stood his ground, with weapons pointed at his neck, ready for the fight. Soon, several instructors advanced toward him, wielding their weapons. Meanwhile, Fidorance observed him, thinking he was arrogant. Finally, his eyes shone intensely. Then Fedian warned Ludica to keep an eye on Najin, saying the boy was dangerous. At that moment, his eyes were glowing as he thought the person was right. Meanwhile, Fidorance also considered that the boy posed a danger. Even so, he maintained his stance, with weapons nearly slicing off his head. In his thoughts, he acknowledged that he had only spoken out of irritation, trying to scare them, but that people were sensitive. Still, he thought it wouldn't be so bad if the fight ended that way. Despite being confused, Najin noticed the caution on a student's face. Soon he also saw the worry and fear on the faces of others nearby. Additionally, he noticed the anxiety of 2 more students close by. Next, a group of students displayed panic, excitement, confusion, and tension. The entire crowd seemed overtaken by chaos and bewilderment. Meanwhile, Doragon looked surprised. Fidorance, in turn, showed he was impressed. At the same time, Black Hen Warren expressed a certain interest. However, Ludica began to feel anger. With that, she furiously confronted Najin, calling the trainees useless and threatening to bring him down by force if the threatening aura didn't stop. At that moment, his eyes began to glow again. He soon closed his eyes. Then, upon opening them again, he seemed to relax. With firmness, Ludica raised her umbrella, declaring that the fight was paused and asking him to wait. Meanwhile, Yolnia was thinking about the boy from Woodian. Then someone asked what the plan was. Next, Fidorance wanted to know what they meant, stating that they needed to cancel everything. However, Zeus disagreed, saying there could be no special treatment and that the evaluation was meant to form the squad, so it couldn't be canceled. Soon after, Durang questioned whether they could stop Najin when needed, expressing uncertainty after what she had seen. With conviction, Ludica responded that they could disqualify him, since they didn't need someone so arrogant. Faced with that, he remained silent. At that very moment, someone questioned his responsibility, asking him to say something. In a calmer tone, Black Hen Warren apologized, explaining that the rising star reminded him of the past. Next, he recalled a previous incident where someone had beaten up knights who had insulted them. The white-haired woman stood in the middle of rubble and fallen knights. Immediately, Ludica and Durang asked if he was referring to Snow White, and if he dared to compare that girl to the powerful night elephant. However, he downplayed the comparison, saying they didn't need to be so strict. Meanwhile, Ludica kept her gaze fixed. Then Najin heard that the next fight would be barehanded. Meanwhile, Yolnia was preparing for the match. Next, she questioned him about the fight, asking what it was for and for whom. Soon, Black Hen Warren explained that it was an evaluation, not made for anyone in particular, and that she should focus on her opponent if she didn't want to lose. With a sigh, she agreed. At the same time, Najin wondered what would happen next. After that, the evaluator signaled the start of the fight with a metallic sound. Thus, both took their positions. At that moment, Najin noticed she wasn't attacking him like Wadran had, realizing she was nervous and cautious. Because of that, she was breathing heavily, thinking he was unguarded and wondering if it was a trap. As she watched, other students observed attentively. Soon, her eyes locked in with determination. Suddenly, he made a quick move to the left. Then, a loud impact struck the ground. With that, Yolnia delivered a powerful kick. At the same moment, he felt the sting of pain, recognizing that she was strong. Soon after, she looked up with a confused expression. In response, he clenched his fist. Even so, he reacted to the strike, claiming he had seen the movement. Even without the dynamic vision to dodge, he could recognize the sign of an attack. Thus, although he couldn't evade it, he braced for the impact, reflecting that it was easier to endure when he knew the hit was coming. Maybe thanks to Luce. At that moment, Luce was smiling, saying that he would build his tolerance. Then she threw a quick punch. At the same moment, the strike hit him squarely and hard. Still panting, he thought that even being aware didn't stop the pain, but he could still control his expression. Meanwhile, she wondered why he remained so calm despite the initial blows, and why he hadn't fought back yet, questioning what his plan was. On the other hand, the evaluator noted it was a peculiar way to fight. Even though Yolnia was attacking, it seemed like he was the one in control. Soon, they stared at each other, and she showed confusion. Observing closely, Noljan realized her mind was starting to waver. Noticing the hesitation, Quering asked why he still hadn't done anything, and Noljan replied that that was exactly the reason. He then explained that the only reason he was taking the hits like that was because he was trying to lose on purpose. The students questioned why he would do that, given his strength. Despite the doubt, Fidorance admitted he didn't know for sure, suggesting that maybe he didn't want to reveal his power, though Yolnia might be interpreting it differently. Breathing heavily, she felt insulted by the idea that he thought she would kill him, which explained her emotional instability. Even so, he thought that a fight without the fear of death was a rare opportunity, perfect to try things out and prepare for the next strike. Then, Yolnia's expression revealed Negin's impressive insight. Meanwhile, this power of observation proved different from dynamic vision, and he noticed both tension and caution in her. Thus, the ability to feel others' emotions was something all humans should have. While others perceived only a few emotions, he could feel many others in detail. Like anyone who had experienced this before, he sensed that he would be attacked soon. Moreover, he could also identify the flow of action, like the movement of a foot. With that, he was able to predict a punch and understand its intent, even if he couldn't avoid it. Even so, he couldn't dodge, but the attack was still meaningful. Even if the destructive power could be cut in half by predicting it, it still hurt quite a bit. That happened because the body unconsciously prepared for the blow. Soon, an unexpected strike would have its destructive power multiplied, and that would be his chance to try a new move. Meanwhile, Nejin and Yolnir remained in a fighting stance, observed by other students. Since he was weaker, he wondered if he could pull off a surprise attack, and so he moved slowly. With that movement, she recoiled sharply, readying herself for a strike. Seeing her reaction, he confirmed that his strategy was working. Then his strength came from his observation, not just expressions, and offered many other possibilities. A sense that she would be attacked soon was strong in her eyes. In a quick motion, she crossed her arms in front of her body. Even so, she remained in the same position, silent and unresponsive. With a quick glance, she peeked through her arms. Then he struck her, pressing hard. Right after, he landed a direct hit. Meanwhile, Lawson and Ter, along with another student, watched the scene with concern. In addition to them, other students were also watching the fight with tense expressions, and further ahead, more students looked apprehensive about what they were witnessing. Nearby, Liaman and another classmate also followed the battle with seriousness. However, Nejin seemed confused about something, though he kept his expression serious. At that moment, the image showed a hand pressing hard against the abdominal region. Even so, she appeared confused, because the destructive power of a strike, even if doubled, shouldn't have been enough. Soon, a quick motion sliced through the air. While being watched by him, she slid back, maintaining her posture. Then she reflected on the strange attack that caused almost no damage, questioning whether it was a martial art meant to shake her internal organs, or if she was simply being underestimated. With her eyes locked, she focused and decided it was best to find out what was going on. At that moment, he realized that she had changed because of his attack, sensing a new determination in her. Soon after, she took a deep breath, appearing exhausted. Thus, she prepared to fight using the martial arts style of the galaxy. With a focused gaze, she looked ready to unleash a thunderstorm. While sweating, he felt that something big was about to happen and pondered how to dodge it. Then, his eyes widened in surprise. Soon she looked at him, who was lying down, and told him to get up. With that, Lawson approached and helped him, asking if he was okay and about the result of the fight. Then Yolnia stated that the fight was over and that he deserved to be knocked out for being so arrogant. She reminded him that she wasn't weak enough to be underestimated. After all, she used the galaxy style. Right after, Yolnia said the treatment was done and that they should go, as she walked a few steps away. Next, Nejin complained about the pride of nobles, but was comforted by Lucian, who said he had done very well and would have won if he had been at full strength. Soon, she gave him a sharp look. At that moment, one of the students was grinning mockingly. With that, Torsen expressed disappointment, saying he was sorry for disgracing his own name. Despite Nejin's defeat, he reflected that this match would become an important turning point for his brother in future battles. Soon, one of the students commended to Yolnia that they saw her talking to another girl, but was promptly told to shut up and be careful. Then Nejin turned and asked where Tyre was. Lawson pointed ahead to where the boy stood. Suddenly, an explosion caught their attention, indicating the fight had already started. Soon, Tyre was fighting and was thrown against a wall. Even so, his eyes remained focused and alert. Meanwhile, someone approached, complaining in an annoyed voice. Further ahead, Marcia, holding a sword, lamented not being able to see him fight. Wiping his face, Tyre commented that maybe he didn't want to show anything. With a sarcastic smile, she reacted to the provocation. From afar, Nejin observed her and wondered how long he had been unconscious. Then he asked Lawson how many fights he had missed, and the boy replied that it had been 2, and that Tyre had just started, but Nejin himself hadn't fought yet. With that, he realized he had missed the chance to see 4 fighters compete. Right beside him, Lucian commented that Marcia was the only one who could beat him. At that moment, she raised her sword, displaying it confidently. Soon after, Tyre was forcefully slammed against the wall again. With a precise strike, the blade passed close to his eyes. Next, Marcia drove her sword into the ground and pointed at him. While looking at the sword, Tyre questioned whether she would fight unarmed or if there was another strategy. Meanwhile, Nejin and Lawson stayed together, and Nejin stated that Tyre could win. Finally, his eyes focused as he urged his friend not to lose himself and to find the most essential part for for that would lead to victory. Then Marcia smiled arrogantly. Meanwhile, Zeus regretted not having seen his strength and wondered what had happened to Najin. Soon, Ludica stated that he had probably been careless and arrogant, saying it was good to see him knocked out, though another student asked if she wasn't being too harsh. Next, Fidorans commented that he shouldn't have underestimated his opponent, Yolnia of the Galaxy, as he had been too full of himself, and he hoped the next opponent would force her to show her true power. Thus, Tyre, gasping for air, looked determined. He walked with firm steps. He held a dagger, ready to strike. With a quick movement, he rushed toward his opponent. At the same moment, she was already in front of him, delivering her attack. At that moment, his eyes widened in surprise. Suddenly, an explosion of light blinded him. Next, Marcia landed a powerful kick that hit him squarely. With that, he slid across the floor from the impact. Even so, he got up quickly, holding his dagger and keeping his fighting stance. Panting, he asked why she was fighting barehanded and what her plan was. In response, she turned with a confident smile, her hair fluttering. Then Nejin noticed that he looked confused and was overthinking, unable to make a proper judgment in that state. Soon, Tyre looked at the weapon stuck in the ground, suspicious of a possible trap. Her sword was driven into the ground, breaking the terrain around it, and then came her fist. However, Tyre skillfully dodged the strike. Quickly, he moved, keeping focus on the next move. Thus, he spun his body with speed, but when he looked to the side, he was surprised not to find her where he expected. With wide eyes, he turned his head quickly and realized she was behind him. Still in shock, he looked around, denying what he saw. Then he looked up and saw her above him. Soon, she came down forcefully, shattering the ground with the impact. Thus, she landed in front of him while he remained on the ground. With a provocative tone, she asked why he wasn't speaking anymore, and if Najin didn't like her. On the defensive, Tyre exclaimed that that wasn't what he had said. At that moment, her eyes locked onto him, watching him closely. Panting and sweating, he thought he couldn't keep dodging and that his energy was running low. Suddenly, Nejin shouted for him to see the essence, stating he still had the advantage. While Lawson watched, he kept encouraging his friend, asking him to think about what had happened to himself. Soon, Zeus intervened and asked if he had lost his mind and what he was doing. Then he replied that he was cheering, but she corrected him, saying he was giving hints and warned him to be careful as he was already being watched. Annoyed, he snapped that she should have warned them earlier about not shouting during fights, questioning the lack of a clear rule system. With that, the three, Lawson, Najin, and Lujin, fell silent, processing the situation. Finally, Zeus thought that he was just saying the right things, which was undeniable, but still gave him a headache. Then he regretted that even though Nejin was trying to help Tyre, he had exposed a blind spot in the system. Soon, Zeus said he should stop doing anything that could affect the fight. With that, the three nodded in agreement. Then he thought and reinforced once again that he needed to see the essence and his advantage, reminding him to think about what had happened to himself. As soon as he heard the words, he quickly moved forward to attack. While moving, he thought about what had happened with Najin, wondering if he was being too shaken. Even so, he realized he had the advantage in speed and that the opponent's skill didn't matter. Ahead, Marcia was smiling, with the sword still embedded in the ground. With focused eyes, he concluded there was only one way to win. Soon after, a swift motion cut through the air. Thus, he charged forward with determination, while being watched closely. During the attack, he reflected on what it would take to win, understanding that this was the true essence. Then he prepared himself, facing her up close. Suddenly, she spun her body and threw a powerful punch. Even recognizing her excellent dynamic vision, he sensed something more was about to happen. Next, his foot slid swiftly across the ground. Soon after, another movement sliced through the air. With surprise in her eyes, she wondered if he had gained more speed. Even so, she thought she could beat him, as long as she kept her focus. At that moment, her eyes glowed intensely. With that, she launched toward him, warning that she could still see him. He looked at her directly, in a silent gesture of gratitude. Then, an inner voice declared that he was superior in speed, and that was the advantage. There was only one thing to do and a single way to win. Finally, her eyes revealed that the secret was to control her vision. With a flash of light, that was the essence. Then Najin fell to the ground with a thud. Soon, Luz smiled at him and said it was good. Next, Lujin stated that it would make him stronger, while Tyre simply watched in silence. At that moment, he kept a thoughtful expression. Suddenly, a loud impact echoed in the sky. As it passed, Nejin coughed, revealing he was hurt. With red eyes, he fixed his gaze on the horizon. Meanwhile, Tyre began to talk about the times when Nagin was mistreated. Hearing that, Najin recalled that he was always there. However, he never intervened and only watched. That was because he had a firm belief. He believed that was how things should be. Even though he didn't see violence as reasonable, he considered it a decision based on the victim's situation. Even so, he thought victims couldn't make rational decisions. With that reasoning, he continued to reflect to himself. So he believed he needed to always observe them, to ensure they didn't cross the line. With a clenched fist, he was someone with his own sense of justice. Soon after, Fedorance asked Durang if he was better than she had imagined, and she replied that she thought it would be easy. Then the two stared at each other in silence. Thus, they stood together with surprised expressions. At that moment, a sharp object appeared in the scene. Soon, that object became clearly visible. With that, Tyre looked around, surprised by what he saw. As he watched Marcia defending herself, he exclaimed that it had worked. Then he declared that this was the moment, while Tyre ran toward her. As soon as he reached her, he made an attack movement. Then Marcia felt something pass very close, with a terrified expression. Finally, she spoke the name Finn. With that, Tyre widened his eyes, showing surprise. At that moment, the sword began to vibrate and glow intensely. Soon he charged at Marcia, who seemed to be under some kind of influence, while the sword remained embedded in the ground. Her eyes shimmered intensely. Then he attacked her with the sword, but she quickly ducked to dodge. After that, he was struck by the girl who still couldn't see. Soon, both of them were pushed back by a strong impact. With a slip, Tyre slid across the floor with his sword in hand. Meanwhile, he lamented being hit in the stomach and wondered if the weapon had a detection ability. Right after, Marcia stood before the sword embedded in the ground. Slowly, she opened her eyes and realized she hadn't fully healed yet. At that moment, Tyre appeared in her vision with a strange aura around his body. In response, she smiled, surprised by his talent, but stated that such things didn't work on her. With that, he realized his ability was useless against Marcia. Then he thought he had already used the flash and had been hit directly, still holding his sword. With that, his eyes revealed the idea that it was a lost game. Soon, Fidorant smiled, regretting having treated him like Marcia's subordinate, as he was fighting well against her and seemed to like the boy. However, he reacted with surprise, stating that wasn't the case. Thus, Tyre raised his hands, declared that he'd have to take back what he said, and forfeited the match. In response, Lawson, Nejin, and Lujin watched the scene in surprise. On the other hand, Marcia showed disapproval. Then Black Hen Warren lamented that the fight had ended that way, calling the student boring. Soon after, he stepped forward. At that moment, Lawson congratulated Tyre, while Najin asked why he had given up. Tyre explained that he used his flash, but the ability didn't work on her, so there was no chance of victory. Even so, Najin questioned the forfeit, stating that there actually was a chance. With conviction, he explained that Marcia had used the ability because she was cornered and had only been bluffing, and that victory depended on whether the knights stepped in. Tyre, with a tired look, asked if he was trying to lecture him. Nejin replied that they should use the experience as a reference to improve next time. However, Tyre retorted that he lost because he was weak, and that it was as simple as that. While walking away, bitterly he said that only Nejin could think about winning, because he wasn't Najin. Soon, Lujin commented to Najin that it had all been out of pity, while observing him seriously. In his thoughts, Nejin considered that Tyre could have won, but gave up long before the end. After that, Tyre walked away slowly. Soon, a hand raised a blue stick, announcing the next match. At that moment, Lawson said it was his turn, while Najin watched him carefully. With a slight smile, Durigan stepped into the field. In the center, Black Hen Warren faced Lawson and Durigan. As soon as they arrived, Lawson greeted his opponent, wishing for a good match. Durigan replied that he had a question, and Lawson promptly asked what it was. Then the opponent asked how the people of Whittian had managed to pass. Soon after, he criticized the group's weakness, mentioning Tyre's pathetic forfeit and Najin's arrogant defeat. Arrogantly, he advised Lawson to give up and go home, so he wouldn't embarrass himself like his friends. Even so, Lawson watched him in silence. Next, he called for Warren, who replied by asking what it was. Lawson then questioned whether the participants' lives were safe during the fight. With disdain, the opposing student mocked his concern. Despite that, Warren smiled and assured there was no reason to worry. Right after, Durigan smiled at his opponent. With a serious expression, he responded affirmatively, ready. At that moment, Nejin was surprised to see him, while Warren declared the start of the fight. While the snow fell and the wind blew, the memories of the past seemed to fade away. As soon as a foot sank into the snow, the thought came that he couldn't last much longer. At that moment, he felt the intense cold as the flakes covered his face. Soon after, he lowered his head because of the wind slicing his skin. Next, he slowly turned his face, observing the white and silent landscape around him. With heavy steps, he walked through the snow, wishing the blizzard would take everything away. Suddenly, he fell to the ground, overcome by cold and exhaustion. Soon, a muffled thud was heard, signaling his fall. As his hand rested on the snow, he felt cold, alone, and deeply unhappy. Even so, he thought it was okay, and that maybe finally he could go to someone's side. However, he wondered whom he would truly join. Then his eyes slowly closed. But as soon as he heard someone telling him to get up, he opened them again with effort. While still on the ground, two voices debated whether he was still alive. With a slight movement, he confirmed that he was. That was when the two approached and asked if he was okay, marking the beginning of that bond. Back in the present, the start of the match was announced. With that, he closed his eyes for a moment, seeking focus. Soon, he opened them again with resolve, revealing determination. Next, Durigan began spinning his weapon with force and precision. In a swift motion, he engaged in an attack with his whip. Quickly, he launched the weapon toward the opponent. Before the impact, he managed to dodge, almost getting hit directly. Right after, he raised his gaze to assess the situation. With a new impulse, he pulled back to prepare the next strike. Meanwhile, he stared at his opponent, who was also spinning his weapon. Intending to counterattack, the adversary prepared his strike firmly. With an agile dodge, he escaped the attack that grazed his face. With that, he continued pressing forward with strong movements. In response, the other swung his weapon violently, aiming with precision. Soon, a powerful impact echoed as it hit something in front of him. With a thunderous sound, pieces shattered and flew in splinters. From a distance, he emerged with his sword in hand. Surprised, the opponent asked if he had used a sheath as a distraction. Without replying, he quickly retreated with his sword drawn. As the opponent advanced, he spun his weapon in another fast attack. At the right moment, he dodged, letting the blow narrowly miss. However, he was hit by a sequence of successive strikes. Hearing the impact, Lujin asked if he had any chance of winning, commenting that he still seemed inexperienced. In silence, Najin watched every detail of the fight. Soon after, Tyre explained that the opponent was stronger than expected, as he calculated the range of attacks and reacted with precision. With that, he continued saying the enemy predicted the moves, dodging easily. Even so, he pointed out that the problem lay in the lack of skill diversity. Despite the strength of the lateral slash, that technique required setup and exposure. Finally, he concluded that basic fundamentals were missing, and that he still relied too heavily on a single move. At that moment, he felt the odds were against him as he took a heavy blow. Meanwhile, the opponent smiled, noticing his sluggishness and believing one more strike would end the match. However, he stopped briefly, as if waiting for the exact moment. In that pause, the adversary wondered why he had slowed down so much. As soon as he heard that, Tyre interpreted the scene as a sign of surrender, expressing surprise. Then the other declared that it was pathetic and that this would be the end. In response, Najin asked her if she really believed that. He then commented that she still didn't truly know who she was fighting. According to him, there was something much simpler and more direct in that boy than others realized. Right after, a crackle of energy ripped through the field like a dry thunderclap. Upon seeing the scene, Lujin exclaimed that the strike had landed, but was interrupted by Najin, who told her to wait. As soon as those words were heard, he showed surprise. At that moment, he thought that the weapon used against him was different from ordinary swords, and that a few strikes wouldn't be enough to bring him down. With a bead of sweat on his face, he revealed his silent effort. Even so, he remained determined and asked the opponent to allow him just one strike. At that, the three spectators were surprised by the honesty of the request. Then he took a deep breath, preparing for the final move. Frustrated, the enemy asked what he was trying to do, assuring him he wouldn't hold back. The next moment, he positioned himself and launched forward quickly. However, the opponent's weapon wrapped around his leg, unexpectedly immobilizing him. As soon as he lost balance, the other swung the weapon toward him. With focus, Najin commented that the blow had been poorly calculated, as that approach would only put him at risk. Right after, the enemy tried to pull him forcefully, but he held his ground, recognizing an opening. With that, he realized he was trapped, but that he could turn the tables if he used his lateral slash. With a powerful motion, he broke the opponent's weapon and knocked over several wooden structures around them. In the end, the observers couldn't hide their surprise at the strength and simplicity of that decisive strike. Then it was revealed that Lawson wasn't from Woodian, while Nejin and Najin asked where he came from and if he remembered anything. With sad eyes, he couldn't answer any of the questions. Although one of the brothers suggested he might have a mental issue, the other quickly scolded him, so one of them simply watched him in silence. Soon after, Negan handed him a potato and asked him to take it slowly, saying it was for him. Next, he offered him a place to stay until his memories returned, but the brother immediately disagreed. With that, Nejin suggested that they make the visitor chop a lot of firewood for them. Then the two looked at each other, a bit confused. Meanwhile, Lawson ate the potato slowly, feeling warmth inside. Soon, Najin emphasized that he would stay only until his memory came back, and the narration revealed that it never did. Thus, Najin watched time pass. However, the outsider remembered one single thing that had scared him deeply. He soon recalled seeing himself in the middle of a forest with many trees cut down. Then he saw the destruction of an entire village, with smoke and debris everywhere. Shortly after, Black Hen Warren watched the scene with interest. Then Zeus and Durang also observed, and Zeus commented on the ability. Soon, a structure collapsed to the ground, raising dust. Next, Darrigan emerged from the dust, asking if that was all Lawson had. Faced with that, he shouted, claiming the boy couldn't do it. With a determined tone, he declared the technique lateral slash. A line of energy was soon launched straight at the enemy. With that, before being caught by the strike, he ducked and let the destruction happen. As soon as he noticed, debris was all around him. With clenched teeth, he realized the boy had used the technique again. Meanwhile, the young man stared at the illuminated spot. Soon, the opponent flew far, being watched by him. In free fall, he continued plummeting through the air, out of control. Then, someone extended a hand toward the boy above. Soon, Black Hen Warren pointed his spear upward. Then he swung the weapon strongly in the air, creating a trail of light. Next, the tip of the spear flew toward Lawson. With that, their weapons clashed, avoiding greater danger. Right after, he was repelled by the force of the spear. Thus, the boy fell to the ground near the houses as Warren watched. With the spear in hand, he announced that the winner of the round was Lawson of Woodian. Soon after, he was sitting on the ground, looking exhausted. In response, all the classmates expressed surprise, and Nejin asked about the spear. Even so, Darrigan clenched his teeth, frustrated by the defeat. Then Warren declared the start of the last fight of the first round. Next, Paimon smiled, and Jiroon confronted him with his weapon. With that, the two clashed in a weapon duel. Soon after, the referee announced Paimon of Latun as the winner, and he felt his arm numb. As the sun set, Black Hen Warren announced the end of the first round and the start of the next for tomorrow, where the winners would face knights. With that, Lawson and the other students showed surprise at the news. Meanwhile, the night sky stretched over the village structures. Then, Wadron commented that the ones from Woodian were lucky to have at least one winner. Soon after, Lawson and Najin remained silent. With that, Lawson asked if his companion knew what that spear was that seemed to move on its own, and he replied that he didn't know. As soon as he heard the answer, Wadron became irritated and explained that it was a Naren celestial weapons that had existed since the beginning of time. Soon, an ancient spear was seen embedded in a tree. Then he continued the explanation, saying that the Narens possessed supernatural powers. Najin asked if the woman's weapon was one of them too. Then Wadron asked if he was even listening, insisting that he had lost because he was inattentive. Then Yolnia whispered something to Nuljin, who nodded. Faced with that, he stated that Najin wasn't inattentive, but that the galaxy style was very strong, and the boy challenged him to say that to Najin's face. At night, Lujin complained about the watch, but Ter replied that they should be grateful to be first, since they could sleep afterward. Meanwhile, the full moon lit up the night sky. In silence, Ludica watched the sky for a few moments. Soon after, she gathered Zeus, Black Hen Warren, Durang, and Fidorans, beginning the meeting. With that, Zeus said that the entire group needed to change their mindset, because despite their boldness, they weren't knightly at all. Then Fidorans asked who the strongest was, and he answered Marcia, receiving the others' agreement. Soon after, Ludica expressed her opinion, saying it was Yolnia. Durang also chose Yolnia as the strongest. Even so, Zeus maintained his choice of Marcia, and then asked Warren who he wanted to fight and which match he looked forward to the most. Calmly, he replied that it was Liaman. Fidorans said he looked forward to Lujin's match, because she didn't give up easily even when at a disadvantage, something he appreciated. On the other hand, Zeus chose Lawson's fight, because he had a unique and powerful strike. Soon after, Ludica said she wasn't looking forward to anyone's fight, but the other considered Wadron fun to reshape. With slight regret, Fidorans commented that Wadron wasn't her type, and when asking Daragon which student fight he was most looking forward to, he nervously chose Yolnia. Next, Zeus changed the subject, asking who was the most necessary at that moment. Surprised, Durang reacted, while Fidorans prepared to reveal the answer. Soon after, all four, Zeus, Ludica, Warren, and Durang, agreed that it was Najin. Zeus stated that it was the first time they had all agreed, and that the boy would be of great use in future missions. Curious, Durang then asked who was the most worthy of becoming a knight. In the end, everyone was about to reveal the obvious answer. Then someone called Najin's name from behind. He quickly turned around, and his eyes gleamed intensely. While he was surrounded by mysterious figures, a hand reached out and called his name. Suddenly, a wooden door slammed shut in front of the calling hand. Next, she pounded on the door repeatedly, shouting for him to open it and asking if he was okay. She could hear strange noises from within and worried whether he could fight so many in such a small space. As the door began to crack, she decided she had to focus and seek help. Soon, the door burst open with a crash, revealing a blinding light. Then the hand stretched out amidst flying debris and strong winds. Thus, Najin saw him standing with a torn cloak, holding a sword and surrounded by destruction, barely managing to say no. At that moment, Najin woke up startled, eyes wide and red, with his hand raised. Immediately, Lujin complained about his foot and told him to get up quickly, saying he was still sleepy too. With a slow gesture, he sat up and tied his hair, while Wadron teased him for talking in his sleep even after being defeated. Silently, he wondered if things would have turned out differently had he made another choice. His red eyes reflected doubt about what might have happened had he chosen differently. Soon after, Black Hen Warren announced that the winners would face the knights that day. Then he pointed at Liaman, stating she would go first since she had won by forfeit. In a firm voice, he asked which knight would go first, and Durang yawned, considering whether it should be him. Fidorant stretched out his arm and declared he would be first, saying it would be a good warm-up. He immediately faced his opponent and warned he wouldn't use his left hand. Their eyes met just as the order to begin was given. Then both moved swiftly, and a cloud of smoke surrounded them. For a moment, she kept her eyes closed. Shortly after, she opened one of her yellow eyes. Her bandaged hand moved quickly with agility. At that moment, Liaman slashed with her sword toward his hand, which blocked the attack. Lujin let out a gasp at the sight of the spear, while Najin appeared surprised, and someone asked if it had shocked him. Still startled, Lujin exclaimed and asked if it didn't scare him, while he remained silent, just watching. Immediately after, Liaman struck with a swift movement. Fidorance blocked her attacks with his hand, pushing them away with bursts of energy. For a moment, Liaman found the fight interesting. Then Tyre thought that her battle and Lawson's were very similar, while Lawson couldn't tell what he was seeing. On the contrary, Najin said it might be a distant relative of his. But meanwhile, the fight continued between them, with Liaman panting. Soon Fedorance asked if she was truly Liaman. With glowing eyes, he said she might be testing a water-style fight and wasn't giving her all. Hearing this, she didn't know how to react. She only said there was no reason to fight at full strength if her opponent wasn't putting in any effort either. Then her expression shifted as if she hadn't really heard what she had just heard. Her response was a smile. Watching this scene, Luzhin remarked that she might not be quite right in the head either. Then she raised her hand, expecting something to approach. At high speed, her weapon was thrown by Raccoon. In the same instant, she grabbed her sword with just one hand as the other was in her pocket. Then she warned him not to regret this choice. Meanwhile, Paimon struggled to lift a sword, being watched by Luzhin. Then Liaman heard someone asking her to catch the weapon spinning through the air toward her. She quickly caught the sword sent to her. Her green eyes shone with tension and sweat. For a few seconds, the two stared at each other before a violent impact. With a crash, Fedorance's blow sent her flying backward. Upon seeing the destruction, Black Hen Warren recalled that killing participants was not allowed. Turning around, Fedorance said he had only struck her with the sword's hilt, ensuring she hadn't been sliced in half. Liaman coughed, feeling the impact of the blow and acknowledging Fedorance's overwhelming strength. Meanwhile, Black Hen Warren watched a boy running before calling the next winners. Wadrin, Yolnia, Turison, Quering, Marcia, Lawson, and Paimon to prepare. Lawson and Najin watched everything in surprise at the situation. Right after, the knight commented that 7 was a large number, so they would need to form groups, and Durang confirmed that the operation would begin at night. Even so, he added that it would be tight to finish everything by then, finding the fights boring but deciding to join anyway. Nejin kept his red eyes fixed on the knight, silently questioning everything. Without delay, Black Hen Warren announced to the 7 students that they were ready for battle. With a crash, he challenged them all at once, saying he would face them alone. Wadrin, Jarun, and the other students were shocked by the sudden announcement. Ludica and Zeus sighed, showing boredom at the scene. Finally, he asked if they shouldn't have fun with that fight. Then Lawson was called. Najin quickly reminded him that it was too late to use the lateral slash after the match had begun. He then instructed him to position himself in advance and wait in the rear for the right moment. Lawson confirmed and asked everyone if they were ready. Thus, Black Hen Warren began the match. Soon after, his hand extended, grabbing his spear in motion. Then he launched into an attack at high speed. Meanwhile, the students ran quickly, but the knight smiled beneath his helmet. After that, he hurled a powerful spear strike into the air. At the same time, Wadrin watched, wondering. He was quickly struck from behind as the opponent mocked his confidence in looking up at the sky. His eyes widened in shock. He was hit by a strike that released a blue light. Soon after, the knight landed with a crash, opening a crater in the ground. Wadrin fell to the floor, with pieces of stone falling around him. At that moment, Zeus instructed the fox, the raccoon, and the wild dog to be ready, saying they would intervene if necessary. Meanwhile, the knight smiled again beneath his helmet. He quickly moved away from the view of his last opponent. Then, Torison asked if the object had been thrown just to distract them. Suddenly, the knight was right in front of him, launching his attack. His eyes glowed with purple energy. Then he delivered a swift blow with his hand. However, the strike was closely watched before the counterattack. Soon, the knight retaliated, hitting him with an explosion of energy. Even after being hit, Torison remained standing, but he was soon knocked out by the powerful strike. At that moment, Jarun and Paimon looked on in surprise. Meanwhile, Najin and Luzhin commented on how incredible the knight's hand-to-hand combat skills were, since he didn't even need weapons to deal with the trainees. Najin concluded that the students' separate movements were inefficient, as they weren't taking advantage of their numbers and were being defeated one by one. Then Yolnia charged toward him. Seeing her, he clenched his fist as he stared at her. With a precise blow, he struck with his fist. The impact caused an energy explosion on the knight's body. Still, the fight didn't stop. Marcia was in the air launching her attack. Meanwhile, Tyre commented that not even knights could defeat 7 trainees without weapons, but Najin disagreed. His red eyes narrowed as he said it wasn't without a weapon. Then Marcia glowed in the air under the light of the approaching object. At high speed, the spear passed by her. The blade quickly fell toward Paimon, who was looking at it. The object passed close to him, making him scream in fright. For a moment, Yolnia was distracted. She then turned her gaze away, while the knight sarcastically asked how she could look away while he was there. After that, someone was heard preparing to execute the lateral slash attack. With a swift movement, Lawson launched his own lateral slash, a wave of energy spreading across the ground. The spear then returned on its own in the direction of the knight. With an impact, Lawson's attack hit the spear, which held firm against the energy. Then she held her weapon and praised the group for finally starting to work together. He looked at her, surprised by the response. She then spun her spear and exclaimed that it was time for real fun. Soon after, she launched a powerful attack with the weapon. Seeing the situation, Zeus ordered them to stop, saying it was already enough. At that moment, Ludica raised her umbrella to block the attack. The strike collided forcefully with Ludica's defense, causing a loud impact. At the same time, the spear went in the direction of the Fidorans. She was struck and pinned to the ground, raising a light cloud of dust around. As she observed the scene, the knight complained that they wouldn't let her have fun, while being stared at by Durang. Right after, a large burst of energy erupted from her, hitting the area violently. She then asked if they weren't overdoing it, suggesting they talk instead of fight. Meanwhile, Warren was complaining about his feelings beside Zeus. Shortly after, Zeus announced that the qualification match had ended and that the squads would be formed. With that, Paimon expressed frustration at not having done anything, while Jeroen watched him in silence. At that moment, Marcia reflected that the fight served only to make the trainees realize the gap between their skills and those of the knights. Soon, Nuljan asked the other if she was okay. Meanwhile, Najin observed that it was an arena, except for one person, and that it was far more useful than common weapons. A few minutes later, the scene calmed down in the village. Then Zeus explained that each squad would have a leading knight and 3 apprentices who would train through missions and be reorganized with each new task. Thus, Nejid began to observe the other 2 students in his new squad. Yolnia, in turn, remained silent, deep in thought. Shortly after, Nuljan expressed her excitement about working with him. Najin replied, likewise, though in his mind he wondered what he should do and if everything would turn out okay. Then the scene shifted to the open sky above the village. A female knight announced the final squad as raccoons, concluding the report. Upon hearing that, Luzhin asked the others where they were assigned, revealing that he belonged to Fedorans' squad. Soon, Lawson said he was part of the Fox's squad, and Tyre said he was with Raccoon. Then Najin revealed he was in Kylan's squad. Thus, Luzhin noted that they had all been separated, and Lawson agreed it was a shame. Right after, she wished for everyone to take care and stay healthy until they met again. At that moment, Zeus called Najin, saying they were leaving and that everyone should be stronger by the next time they met. With that, he and the rest of the squad began to walk, explaining they would go slowly and had to leave early. Meanwhile, Lawson asked if the other would be okay alone, but Luzhin replied that she should worry about herself, since it was Najin. Even trying to argue, he was interrupted by Tur, who agreed they should focus on themselves. After that, she looked at him silently, while the 3 stood still for a moment. Even without being able to use his power like before, Tyre thought the other didn't seem any weaker. As Nejin walked away, he moved alone through the village. At that moment, Nejin reflected on Zeus's words and wondered if he had grown attached to the group. Soon after, the 4 knights followed a trail through the forest. Once Zeus sat on a tree trunk, he declared it was time for a break. Then Najin asked if he could ask a question, and Zeus invited him to proceed. With that, the apprentice asked about Narine weapons, like Oron's spear, and how one could obtain one. Zeus then asked if he wanted one, explaining they weren't easy to get, and not everyone could wield them. He went on to detail that Narines chose their true wielders, and without that choice, their abilities couldn't be used. With that, Nejin concluded that getting one of those weapons wouldn't be easy. Shortly after, Zeus stared at him in silence. Then he announced that he would take him with him. Immediately, Fidorens expressed surprise, saying he thought Zeus didn't like people like Nejin. Zeus then explained that despite that, there was something he wanted to confirm. At that moment, the other kept a serious expression. Thus, the knight said that Nejin was strange and difficult to understand, because his fight with Yolnia had been too absurd to be a simple mistake, and his deadly aura showed he wasn't weak. As he spoke, he remembered the moment when Nejin looked at the apprentice intensely. Silently, he wondered if the other was acting weak on purpose, questioning what he would gain from that, and what his true intentions were. With that, he continued to observe him carefully. Soon, Najin realized that Zeus suspected him. At that moment, Najin reflected that among the knights, 2 stood out for their sharp insight, one with heightened senses, and Zeus with excellent judgment. He soon thought it was better to maintain a poor impression because of the fight, while Yolnia offered water to Yolnia, who declined and pointed at him. With that, she expressed surprise. Next, she apologized for underestimating him, praised his galaxy style, and admitted to neglecting her fundamentals, sincerely thanking him. Then she gave a faint smile. Afterward, she smiled more openly. Even while praising her perception, he suggested to Nuljan not to be so hard on herself, since she was extremely strong, and the galaxy style could make anyone feel small. At that moment, Najin asked if she could teach him some fundamentals, stating he would learn a lot. She and the other boy looked at him in surprise. Still, she declared that she would teach him the basics of the galaxy style, because she believed it was the duty of the strong to care for the weak. Despite Nuljan's doubt, she assured that teaching the basics wouldn't be a problem. Meanwhile, Zeus wondered whether the other relied only on instinct and lacked foundation, or if he was just using the request as an excuse to learn the galaxy style. Looking directly at him, He thought the boy might have suspected him. Little did he know that Najin was sweating nervously at that very moment. As he got up, he said he might need to go far, ordering everyone to keep moving, though he still thought the boy might not be that perceptive. A little farther away, Najin was carefully watching his instructor. After thinking for a moment, he felt relieved. The next morning, they all walked slightly behind the instructor. After a few more hours, they were already in a completely different environment. As the campfire burned, someone commented that being powerful was different from being strong. With everyone seated around the fire, Zeus said that to be powerful was to be able to kill the opponent in front of you. Hearing that, his students remained silent. He then said that being strong was to face your opponent and not be able to kill them. He added that at night, one should be strong and not powerful, just as the saying described, and ordered everyone to take it seriously. After hearing that, Nejin thought about the matter. A few days later, Zeus announced that they had arrived at Kronel, the site of their first mission. From afar, the four knights observed the walled city. He soon commented that the place was bigger than Woodian and closer than expected, justifying the choice because he couldn't move like the others. At that moment, Yolnia said she was hungry, while Nuljan asked what the task would be. Zeus reassured them, explaining that it wasn't anything dangerous, but first, they would need to find someone. They both asked who it was. In response, he smiled enigmatically. Then he revealed the person was the mage, displaying a hooded figure with a glowing orb in their hands. The group entered through the gates of Kronel. As they walked, Najin asked the purpose of meeting the mage, and Zeus explained that it wasn't just a meeting, but a mission to escort him to the capital, which made the boy thoughtful. Najin then questioned the reason. However, Zeus replied that it was strictly confidential and could not be revealed. Thus, Nejin considered the difficulty of following orders without explanation. Soon, Yolnia and Nuljan's stomachs growled. Then Zeus asked if the boy was hungry, and he confirmed that he was. So Yolnia suggested they stop to eat, since Nuljan was nearly starving. In response, Zeus decided to find the mage alone, ordering the others to stop and eat, but to be quick, as they would leave as soon as he returned. After that, he walked away while the three waited. They then exchanged glances in silence. Soon, Yolnia asked what they should eat. Then Nuljan asked what Yolnia wanted, and she requested something that was soup and not soup at the same time. Meanwhile, Najin was walking through the busy street. He then said he didn't really care. Suddenly, Nuljan alerted him about his sword. With a quick reflex, Najin touched his hip and realized the weapon was missing. He quickly turned his head. Soon after, he noticed someone moving away at high speed. A hooded figure was slipping through the crowd, holding his sword. Immediately, Nuljan exclaimed it was a pickpocket and told them to catch him. Najin then looked intensely, his heart pounding. Meanwhile, the hooded figure ran, and a thudding sound echoed through the air. His red eyes glowed intensely. For a moment, the figure looked back. Suddenly, Nejin's eyes widened. He then started running. Along the way, he questioned if it was one of the masked bandits, if it was a trap, and whether they were right to chase them. In response, Nuljan called him and ran down an alley. Thus, the three of them approached the masked thief, while Yolnia warned him that he had picked a fight with the wrong people, as they were knight trainees on a mission. Before them, the figure held the sword in a narrow alley. His eyes glowed with unusual intensity. Then, Yolnia charged quickly using the galaxy style. Next, a burst of lightning struck the ground between Nuljan and Najin. Immediately, Yolnia widened her eyes in surprise. With a swift move, she dodged a fast attack, impressed she had managed to avoid it. With a serious look, she warned the others to be careful, because the figure was dangerous. Next, the masked one jumped at them. With determination, Nuljan clenched his fist. He quickly tried to punch, but had his attack blocked swiftly and was pushed back. Meanwhile, Najin stared at the enemy, who still held his sword. Deep down, the masked one thought he had expected this. Then, the young man realized this was the one they had been looking for. His opponent's strike quickly approached. In an instant, someone appeared with a swift movement, striking him hard and sending him flying backward. Then he jumped onto the rooftop. Soon after, a man with black hair wearing a wine-colored outfit threw Nejin's sword to the ground. The man then asked if they still wanted to continue. At that moment, Nejin asked who he was, while the masked figure watched them from the top of the roof. With a frustrated gesture, the figure showed annoyance. Then he jumped from the roof and vanished into the shadows. Najin quickly thought that chasing them now would be risky, and the black-haired man asked if he was hurt anywhere. With eyes fixed on him, she questioned his identity again. However, the man only smiled in response. Then Yolnia asked if he was a knight, but he replied that he wasn't, that he was just a nomad, and smiled again. Next, Nuljan expressed surprise at his skill and thanked him for the help, but the man replied that thanks weren't necessary. After that, Najin picked up his sword, and Nuljan called him clumsy, while Yolnia humorously corrected the word. Thus, the three remained silent for a moment. Soon, the black-haired man turned his attention to Nejin. Then he asked if they had met before. Once again, he just smiled. Then he reflected that one never knows who they've met and wondered if their paths would cross again in the future. At that moment, Yolnia and Nuljan called Najin, urging him to come eat, since Nuljan was still hungry. With that, they started walking, while Yolnia asked if they should eat something like soup. From a distance, The man watched them as they walked away. For a while, he remained silent. Shortly after, he expressed displeasure, remembering that he had told him not to act alone. Meanwhile, he looked at the broken wall. In the same spot, the masked man knelt, staring at him. With a guilty tone, he apologized, explaining that the chance to kill Najin was too good to pass up. However, the man replied no, because if the boy truly was a son of fire, they couldn't kill him. Faced with that, the masked man asked what he thought, if there was really a chance that Najin was a son of fire. For a moment, the man hesitated, observing him carefully. As he adjusted his clothing, he commented that he had been informed of Najin's defeat in the evaluation match, but that he seemed to have enough potential. Then he removed his mask and suggested they continue watching him for a while longer. Thus, the trio kept walking, with Najin seeming increasingly pensive. Then Zeus reported a change in the situation and said they needed to leave immediately, while they were eating along the road. Soon after, Yolnia's gaze, with Najin in the background. Meanwhile, Noljin commented that their rations were almost gone. In a calm tone, Zeus assured them they would find a solution and promptly ordered the group to stay on course. Next, the hooded character revealed his face and introduced himself as Shounen, a mage. While Najin asked about the situation's development, Noljin just nodded in response. With some hesitation, Shounen revealed that he felt he was being watched and asked for protection, fearing assassination. In response, the three listened carefully to the explanation. For a moment, Najin wondered if they were being observed by the masked bandits, but quickly considered he might be jumping to conclusions. Even so, Zeus advised caution, stating that while the danger was real, they were all strong, yet Shounen insisted he needed help. In a low voice, Yolnia murmured the word Kylan. As the journey continued, Yolnia asked about lunch. Above them, the sky remained clear over the landscape. Then, a hand held a plant, explaining it was nutritious and common, but needed to be cooked before eating. Uncomfortably, Yolnia asked if they were going to eat a weed, but Zeus corrected him, explaining that kind of knowledge was useful in situations like this. Then, Zeus decided that he and Yolnia would stay to guard Shounen, while Noljin and Najin would go search for food. Soon after, a hand pulled a plant from the ground. Noticing it, Najin told him to leave it, explaining it was only edible on its own. Curious, Noljin asked how he knew that, and Najin explained that he had lived near mountains and had eaten many of those plants. With that, Najin changed the subject and asked about his disqualification from the evaluation match. In response, he just gave a serious look. Next, he revealed that the match was awful, that he lost because he was weak, and that he was nothing without Yolnia. For a moment, Najin watched him in silence, deep in thought. Then Noljin shifted the topic and asked why the shield was considered the most advantageous weapon. Naturally, Najin explained that if the spear and shield were the best, then both must have been made from the most durable materials. With that, he realized that if neither item broke, the shield bearer would win. To elaborate, Najin said that even with equal skills, the shield had the advantage because anything could happen. Admiringly, Noljin praised the other's insight and told him to go find more food, asking if spear and shield were truly equals. Soon after, two hands offered a bowl of food. With a regretful tone, Noljin apologized to Yolnia for not managing to get meat for the meal. In response, she asked Shounen to turn the food into meat with his magic. However, he asked if she seriously expected him to turn herbs into meat with magic. With an irritated look, Shounen thought that non-mages viewed magic as a superpower. As he reflected, he concluded that spells were complex and that a single mistake could completely nullify them, questioning whether it was possible to alter matter while ignoring physics. Embarrassed, he ended up admitting he couldn't perform such a feat. Despite the tension, the sky remained clear. As soon as everyone finished eating, Zeus announced they would have a short training match before leaving. Since he had lost the previous match, Noljin was mentioned. Then Zeus stated that he and Najin would compete. He soon explained that the fight, unarmed and lasting 3 minutes, would serve to analyze weaknesses and give feedback, starting the countdown. At the word 3, Noljin swallowed hard. Next, Najin, with a fixed gaze, heard 2. Zeus then said 1 and immediately gave the command to begin. As the combat began, Najin leaped toward the direction of his opponent. During the jump, he thought he needed to keep a safe distance to dodge any unexpected attack, remembering what had happened before. He also kept a watchful eye. Carefully, he observed the traits, techniques, and habits of the previous match winners. Meanwhile, he thought about how he could combine the fundamentals of the galaxy style, which he had learned from Yolnia, and apply them in the fight. Soon, Najin raised his fists, preparing for battle. Faced with this, the other shrank slightly but also raised his fists. He knew he couldn't mimic the strength of his opponents, but he could make it look like he could. From afar, Yolnia noticed how quickly Najin had learned. In turn, Noljin realized how much his opponent had grown, without the obvious vulnerabilities from the last match. With admiration, he concluded that it was remarkable. Meanwhile, Najin kept his fists up, cautious, showing no fear. He thought that was a good thing. Quickly, he jumped toward him. As he prepared the strike, he recalled the technique he had used against Yolnia. On reflex, Noljin crossed his arms to block the attack, which was aimed at his head. During the impact, he thought Najin was stronger than before, but not by much. Even so, Najin reflected that if his striking power wasn't enough, he'd have to find the opponent's weak spot. Then he looked for a place where a light blow could cause damage. something he knew well from having felt it before, and concluded that, since they were both human, the other had the same weaknesses. With that, he landed a strong blow. While his gaze remained intense, he saw the other take a few steps back, but soon he paused for a moment. Noljin felt intense pain after the hit and hunched over. Surprised, Najin realized his attack had worked. At that moment, the mage commented that the strike was brutal, and then lamented not knowing how much healing magic she could use to help. Calmly, Zeus reassured her, explaining that Yolnia had some healing magic. Surprised, Schumann became irritated upon realizing that she had magic and yet asked for something so ridiculous, but he quickly calmed down. Zeus thought about what had just happened, as the attack had clearly been aimed at the face. However, even though Noljin had raised his arms to protect himself, the blow had ended up hitting his stomach. He immediately remembered something similar that had happened during the evaluation match, and wondered whether this might be some kind of technique different from the galaxy style. Coincidentally or not, the point of impact was the liver, a region that, when struck hard, can disable movement. Still, Zeus continued to observe attentively. Meanwhile, Najin wondered whether the strike hadn't been strong enough, thinking that if it had landed properly, the other wouldn't even be able to breathe. Soon after, Noljin sighed in relief, feeling his heart pounding. He squinted to see better. Then he realized it really was the galaxy style. In the next moment, Noljin clenched his fist and ran toward him. Quickly, he delivered a blow, but the other dodged swiftly. He soon thought that this was the true form of the galaxy style, something on a completely different level. From the outside, Zeus found the situation odd. Nejin was still using weak offensive strategies, similar to those in the evaluation match. Faced with this, he wondered if Najin might be like him. Suddenly, he ordered that they stop there. Noljin said the match time wasn't over yet. However, he replied that it was fine, since he could tell each of them where they needed to improve. He then asked Najin if he had any reason for that weak attack. Najin remained silent for a moment. He wondered why they were asking him that, then answered that he did. Accepting his words, Zeus agreed and suggested they leave. Meanwhile, in another location, Ludica asked the students if they were tired and if they wanted to take a break. Panting and coughing, they replied that they didn't. Smiling, Ludica said that was great, and that they would now increase the training speed. Surprised, the students just nodded. The scene shifts to Fittermans, who quickly intervenes and warns her not to get too proud. He stated that there were many others far stronger than everyone there, and explained that everyone would improve greatly if they paid attention to the tips and dedicated themselves to training. Durang then smiled and said that whoever wanted to quit should speak up right away. All the students replied that they wouldn't give up. With a satisfied look, Durang agreed that was good enough. Meanwhile, Wandrin was watching her, visibly uneasy. Black Hen Warren then asked what they would do if he tried to kill them right at that moment. The girls were surprised, and Marcia was the first to respond. She would face him alone so the others could escape and get help. Warren showed surprise at her answer. Marcia explained that even if there were 3 of them, they wouldn't stand a chance, and since she was the strongest, she would try to hold him off. Warren praised her confidence but told her not to show off. He asked how long she thought she could hold him, and if the others could really escape, knowing what his weapon was. The 3 girls fell silent, staring at him. Warren then said he expected better answers next time, and wondered if they would be able to think faster in a real situation. Zeus, observing, warned the others Warren was dangerous. He said to stay away from him. Soon after, Schumann expressed surprise upon seeing Black Hen, asking if he was his colleague. Zeus replied that they weren't sure yet. Schumann, crying in fear, said he wouldn't go, while Noljin asked why Black Hen was put in charge of guiding the apprentices. Zeus explained that it was because of him. Surprised, Noljin questioned the reason for Black Hen's bad reputation, since her black color would make her. Zeus paused and asked if he believed in the theory that the darker the color, the stronger the person. Yolnia commented that she found pastel colors prettier and asked if that theory was false. Zeus then asked for Najin's opinion on the matter. Najin reflected that the belief existed because being strong also means leaving a lasting impression. He explained that cases like his, involving dark colors and high strength, made people associate color with power, creating bias. Zeus commented that people believe what they want, and coincidentally, he and Najin thought alike. Soon the boy asked if he was stronger than Black Hen Warren. Zeus stepped forward and replied that he was much weaker, which surprised Najin. Thoughtfully, he added that if they wanted to know something even more interesting, he was weak overall. He explained that he was probably on the same level as Yolnia, who reacted with surprise. Zeus concluded by saying that was exactly why they had all been assigned to him, because they were already strong. Then he instructed Najin to imagine an opponent at night level and to plan the group's strategy, saying he expected their answers the next morning. Yolnia reminded Najin that the galaxy style was of night level, but he suspected that Zeus had mentioned it on purpose for the strategy assignment. Najin believed he could figure out a way to attack the imaginary opponent, but he still lacked strength, and that was what they needed to make up for. He then called the mage and immediately said what he wanted. Najin stated that he had a few questions and also a request. Soon afterward, night fell. In the darkness, a bandaged hand held a piece of paper. Then the mage was labeled as a kind of fool, something terrible. Next, a shadowy and imposing figure appeared, introducing herself as the first spear of the royal guard. She then announced that she was departing. Black Hen Warren analyzed someone's intentions, reading expressions, tone of voice, and body language, and seemed to enjoy doing so. Still, Nejin thought that, as always, he couldn't understand that person. Elsewhere, Zeus was walking away when someone called him Cerulean Pylon. He cast a brief look behind him, then turned his head in silence. Najin thought that Zeus was expressionless, impossible to read, perhaps because he was hiding so many things. The mage interrupted, asking if he was still listening. He confirmed and commented that magic seemed like a series of precise calculations, and asked what the next step was. She replied that the next step was invocation, the moment when one begs the magical forces. Najin found the use of the word beg strange, but she confirmed it was exactly that. She explained that magic depended on how much the magical powers favored the mage based on the equation and talent, and that this determined the effectiveness of the spells. Najin asked if it all came down to talent, but she said no. It was uncommon for the powers to favor someone, and without a precise equation, the magic wouldn't work. When Najin asked about her, the mage replied that she was skilled in both areas. She said that's exactly why she was a mage. She slid over a piece of paper that glowed with light blue energy. He explained that the simple light spell on that paper would show Najin's magical strength according to the brightness of the glow. He instructed him to hold the paper with both hands, imagine the surrounding air gathering, and whisper the word light. Najin closed his eyes and focused. As soon as he whispered light, an intense flash burst from the paper. Elsewhere, Black Hen Warren was watching the city and soon stated that he was a magus. Two students, including Wadrin, asked in surprise if that was true. Fidorance confirmed, yes, he really was a magus. The three students looked at each other, questioning why a magus would be there. Durang answered that it was to prepare for war, but she quickly corrected herself, saying that actually, it was a secret. The students Jeroen and Marcia asked if they were going to meet the magus. Ludica confirmed while opening a door. Fidorance, impatient, pushed the door open forcefully and shouted, asking if the magus was there. Durang was shocked by her attitude. Black Hen Warren looked inside and commented seriously that there was a problem. A hooded figure was lying on the floor and black blood stained the wall. Meanwhile, Nejin's hair was glowing with intense light. Nejin looked very surprised. Zeus released a blue glow, and the boy was still holding the paper, which was shining. He soon held the glowing paper and ordered everyone to stop. As the paper was held, it emitted a hum and shone even brighter. The glow persisted, steady, between the fingers of the one holding it. Najin and the magus watched the glow until she asked what was happening, suspecting that someone had tried to contact Zeus. Suddenly, the magus widened her eyes and pointed to the paper in Najin's hands. He was also surprised. His red eyes shone intensely. However, the paper in his hand emitted no glow. Najin thought, disconcerted, that maybe magic really wasn't for him. The magus, smiling slightly, commented that such a result was not common. Noljin looked at Yolnia, who said she knew how to use a little magic. He pondered what she said and wondered whether that earlier glow hadn't been caused by Zeus. Meanwhile, the leader nearby calmly observed the paper that moved slightly between his fingers. The magus explained that the item was a Katon, an emergency communication device used by knights, activated and locked in a way that anyone could use it. Najin asked if that kind of thing was made by genius Magi. Smiling proudly, she answered yes and said she herself was capable of making them. And Noljin and Yolnia were surprised. Urgently, Najin asked if she could help them since it was an emergency. Zeus revealed that the magi the other team had gone to retrieve had been murdered, and that the magus they were protecting was probably the next target. The magus, Noljin, and Yolnia reacted in shock, and soon the magus even begged for protection. Zeus stated that the first step was to find out if there was a spy among them. Najin and the magus listened carefully. Noljin and Yolnia exchanged suspicious glances. Zeus looked at the ground, reflecting, and agreed with the raised hypothesis, acknowledging that it was a precise deduction. He thought it was cruel to assume immediately that there was a spy, but since he usually spoke coldly, perhaps he didn't mind, which helped him see things objectively. Najin kept a watchful, deep gaze. Even so, Zeus declared that from all indications, there were no spies among them, and commented that one of the people there cared more about the next meal than the magus in question. Yolnia discreetly shrugged, embarrassed. Noljin blushed slightly at the comment. Zeus continued, saying that none of them were the spy and that the very suggestion of unmasking a traitor came from someone sincere, and he didn't believe it was one of them. Najin remained serious, analyzing the situation. Zeus assured them that he wasn't the spy after all. If he were, he would have killed the magus the moment they went to get her, and asked them to stop looking at him that way. The magus realized that Najin might suspect her, but as he reflected, he understood that she wasn't the spy. After all, she didn't know the details of the mission. Zeus explained that they would change routes, although it was likely they'd encounter the enemy along the way. The magus asked if that was for the better, and he replied that they weren't the ones who had found the body. He soon warned that they needed to plan immediately and asked if Najin had any ideas. He then responded yes, and that he would restructure the strategy based on each person's real abilities. Zeus was surprised by the comment and asked what he meant by that, since he had warned them all from the beginning, asking if they thought he was joking. Najin and Yolnia watched him with tense expressions. A bead of sweat silently ran down. The boy asked, astonished, if Zeus was really weak. With determination in his eyes, Najin said it was best they start planning. Meanwhile, dart drops were falling to the ground. Liaman, Yusa, and Lucian watched the scene in shock. Fiterance, wounded in the shoulder, was called Wild Dog as he held his weapon. With a determined step, the man advanced toward them. At the door, a shadowy and imposing figure with red eyes held their weapon. Fiterance clenched his fist and ordered the girls to turn around. With steady, shining eyes, he shouted for them to run. A fast, glowing strike sliced through the air. Right after, a large explosion shook the area. An intense flash of light burst forth. The glow continued to expand rapidly. Fiterance raised his massive sword, slamming it into the ground with force. With a quick motion, he charged at the enemy. Then he gripped the hilt of his weapon with resolve. His eyes shone intensely, showing his focus. Soon, he delivered a slashing blow that knocked the enemy down. Then, a shadowy figure wearing a hat appeared. Even so, his gaze remained fixed, despite the dirt on his face. With that, a dark energy began spreading rapidly. The shadowy figure then approached, asking if he belonged to the regular knights. Meanwhile, Lucian and Yusa were running, seeing a large column of light in the distance. At that moment, he felt a sharp pain and could barely react. A powerful beam of energy had been launched. Soon after, the shadowy figure revealed himself with his weapon. Fiterance looked at the scene, confused that his attack had no effect. In response, the enemy spoke with disdain, evaluating his opponent. Meanwhile, Najin asked if the figure was an independent knight. Then Zeus watched the scene closely. He explained that there were two types of knights: the qualified, who require exams. The second was the independent knight, a title given to influential figures to prevent rebellion against the emperor. With that, he asked what the greatest difference between them was. Nulgen replied that the difference was in combatability, as qualified knights should be superior for passing the exams. Zeus agreed that qualified ones were generally stronger, but some independents were very powerful, since not every strong person wants to be a knight. Then Yolnia asked if the difference was about honor, and he partially confirmed. Right after, he went on to explain that the greatest difference between qualified and independent knights was about to be revealed. Then he revealed the G's, showing a chained sword. As soon as Najin asked what the G's was, he explained that all qualified knights must swear loyalty to the emperor. He added that the oath varies greatly for each knight, being known only by the emperor and the knight himself. Then he concluded by explaining that for a qualified knight, the oath is worth more than life itself and would never be broken, questioning the true purpose of such vows. Najin added, explaining that the oaths exist for control. With firmness, Zeus confirmed, saying that was exactly it. The text explained that the oaths could include rules like not killing with one's back to the east, only killing those with both feet on the ground, or not attacking what cannot be seen with the naked eye. Finally, he stated that these oaths are fatal limitations in battle and serve to control the qualified knights, who accept those weaknesses. Yolnia seemed to understand the explanation, while he said that the G's, which binds the knights, symbolizes the chains wrapped around the sword. Najin asked if the shadowy figure was an independent knight, and Zeus clarified that all of it was just a manner of speaking. Then he revealed that he was a qualified knight who had become weaker after swearing his G's, but had received a special power in return. Right after, he declared that the power was a secret and asked Najin, Yolnia, and Nulgen to keep everything they heard confidential. At that moment, Najin thought that if Zeus were really weak, he would be in danger, since his plan to be protected by knights until growing stronger would be compromised. With that, he realized that if they were ambushed by masked bandits at that moment, they would be very vulnerable. Then Zeus said they had reached their destination. Najin opened his eyes wide in surprise. Soon, the sound of footsteps on ice was heard. He looked at the vast frozen landscape, recognizing it as the ice desert. His eyes widened in alarm. Despite that, he expressed his desire to travel through the entire ice desert, the Crystal Sea, and the Finger Rock Mountain. While Yolnia touched the ice, she asked if he wasn't excited. Yolnia complained about the cold, and Zeus scolded her for touching everything, revealing that the forest was the strategy zone of the Wild Dog, and that they would be joining his team. With relief, Yolnia commented that it was good to be near his group and exclaimed with hope. At that moment, Shuma informed Najin that he had completed his task and, with disdain, demanded respect, calling him a barbarian. He remained with his back turned, observing the place. Then he gave a slight smile. Soon he looked up at the sky, where the sun shone intensely over the ice desert. Zeus called him, asking what he was doing and telling him to hurry. Even so, he continued to observe the vast, frozen landscape. Then he turned and replied that he was already coming. Shuma Schumann asked if he was enjoying the view, and he answered hesitantly. Suddenly, Zeus's gaze became serious and alert. He then ordered everyone to stop and stay on guard. With that, he warned that something was approaching from that direction, coming from the forest. Schumann, Nulgin, and Najin looked that way with serious expressions. Then, the sound of something moving through the vegetation was heard. Zeus kept his eyes fixed. Soon, more noises came from the bushes. Lujin emerged from the forest, visibly wounded, screaming in pain. He stopped, panting, on the path as everyone watched him. Yolnia and Najin asked Lujin what was going on. Without delay, he revealed loudly that it was Fitterance, to everyone's surprise. Zeus calmly asked him to explain what had happened. Soon after, a great explosion of light occurred behind them. With that, Yolnia and Najin turned around, surprised and concerned. The shadowy figure in a hat appeared, with a dripping weapon. Faced with this, Zeus dismissed the need for explanations and prepared for battle. Finally, he fixed his gaze and ordered everyone to get ready for combat. Beyond the central continent of Nagyan lies the eastern continent, where war is quickly approaching. There, 5 legendary spears protect the king of that threatened land. The leader among them is the first spear, Nerion, who became a broken spear after a mysterious incident. Thus, she crossed the sea in silence, and is now present on this frozen field. Soon, Zeus asked Lujin if it was her, and she confirmed immediately, without hesitation. He noticed that the figure seemed to come from the east, something evident in her posture and clothing. As he took a few steps forward, he ordered the trainees to protect the mage at all costs. The trainee nodded firmly, ready to act. Next, Zeus recommended they figure out for themselves how to stay alive in that scenario. At that moment, he charged and attacked without warning. He stomped forcefully on the ice floor, which cracked beneath the impact. With a second move, he was thrown far away with brutality. Wasting no time, she ran across the shattered ice, gaining speed. Soon she was close again, eyes locked on the target. With a sudden spin, her body blurred in the air, making her harder to see. Zeus reacted with a serious, focused gaze, maintaining control of the situation. Then he attempted another quick strike, looking for an opening in her guard. He barely dodged, feeling her blade brush his face. Quickly, he pressed his own hand against the opponent's weapon, stopping its movement. At that moment, Nerion remarked that he had finally taken his hands out of his pockets, calling him rude. Zeus was confused by the provocation, trying to understand what it really meant. Meanwhile, Najin observed and concluded that the masked warrior was there because of the mage and had come from the east. Suddenly, Zeus took a full punch, delivered with devastating force. With the impact, he slid across the ice, leaving deep grooves on the ground. Even injured, he gritted his teeth with rage and effort, trying to stay conscious. Soon after, Nerion began to approach, taking slow, firm steps. Still on the ground, Zeus gathered strength and struggled to rise. With his eyes locked on her, he watched as she approached, trying to process what had just happened. Then Nerion turned to the trainees, saying she would decide on her own what to do with the little mage. Next, she asked the others to show themselves, as she didn't yet know their faces. Najin remained thoughtful, assessing the situation and possible strategies. With disdain, Nerion spun her weapon, leaving a trail of sliced air around her. She then moved it at great speed, creating gusts that sliced through the cold wind. At that moment, Najin saw shards of ice flying. Then Yolnia appeared with a thunder attack in the galaxy style, concentrating her energy. Nerion raised her weapon and cast magic, aiming precisely. Shouting, she ordered Najin and Nulgin to protect the mage, but was surprised by a quick slash. With that, she was thrown violently backward, hitting the ground. Nerion stood over her, watching her coldly through the mask. Zeus, in the background, was closely observing the details of that helmet. Yolnia clenched her fists tightly, showing her frustration. Then she and Zeus attacked together, making their energies clash against the enemies. Behind the mask, Nerion revealed a determined gaze, firm and without hesitation. Her body blurred once more, indicating absurd speed. Zeus widened his eyes, shocked to recognize that technique he had seen before. Soon, she moved through the combined attacks, dodging smoothly. Then Zeus staggered as he took the full impact of the blow, feeling the weight of that force. Meanwhile, Yolnia coughed up blood, a clear sign she had suffered a serious injury. Soon after, a part of her body gave out, and the impact made the ground tremble beneath her feet. With that, Nulgin and Najin watched in surprise as their companion suddenly fell. She lay on the ground, breathing heavily and visibly shaken. At that moment, a flashback appeared in her mind, revealing a younger Yolnia declaring to Nulgin that she would become his servant, as heir to the galaxy style. Then, with conviction, she stated that the strong must protect the weak, calling him her savior with certainty. However, her father, without offering encouragement, only told her to keep training hard, without any praise. Even so, she did not complain and kept practicing every day, determined to improve. Next, a fist clenched tightly and a drop of blood ran from it, marking the moment. Yolnia's father told Najin that he had so much talent that he made the galaxy style itself seem small by comparison. With that, he asked his daughter to train even harder, so that one day she could be as good as that promising boy. Yolnia replied with a steady gaze, silently deciding something in that instant. Meanwhile, Nuljan thought that, no matter what happened, he would always tell her she was the best and that he would be her subordinate. Then he murmured to himself that it was only his own selfishness, while Najin watched him silently. Next, he took a few steps forward and asked the mage to heal Yolnia as soon as possible. Schumann, hesitant, asked what the point was if they were all about to die, but still agreed to the request. At that moment, Nerian charged again with ferocity toward Nuljan. However, he simply closed his eyes, calmly preparing for the next move. Then he activated the first page of the galaxy style, releasing an intense aura around him. With that, he delivered a thunderous strike so powerful that it caused a large-scale ice explosion. Najin watched the boy, astonished by the power unleashed before his eyes. Even so, Nerian merely cracked the ice beneath his feet and seemed unaffected by the impact. Next, Nuljan looked at Najin, now completely surrounded by electricity. Then he turned around, making one last request in a steady, restrained voice, asking him to keep it all secret from Yolnia. Then Yolnia completed a powerful blow by activating the first page of the galaxy style. Right after, she breathed with difficulty, feeling the exhaustion after the move. Meanwhile, she stood before the hole she had made in the wall, under Nuljan's distant, watchful gaze. With admiration, he praised her and reflected that the essence of the galaxy style had been passed down only to her. However, she offered to teach the fundamentals to the boy, since kindness to the weak was part of the spirit of that style. After that, he carried logs of wood, showing fatigue on his face. Next, he looked to the side with seriousness. Then he tried to use the galaxy style out of curiosity, as if it were a game. With that, he found himself before a broken rock formation, revealing a hidden talent. Even so, he decided he would never speak of it to anyone, out of respect for her. At that moment, Najin's mind went blank as he stared at the ice desert he so longed for. However, he was not Najin, but Najin. Thus, he regained consciousness only because of the other boy, impressed by his strength. While reflecting, Nuljan believed he had lost because he was weak and was only lying to himself. Soon his thoughts aligned, and Najin realized he had to find a way out of the situation. Then he thought about the gravity of the moment and the need to focus in order to escape. With that, the masked man demanded that the boy kill Najin in order to survive. Soon, a blade pierced the young man's chest, coming from his own hands. Then he gripped the hilt of the sword tightly. Meanwhile, he continued to hold the weapon, as Fadian smiled beside him. Then, a group of masked figures discussed their next targets. At that moment, Zeus reported that the mages another team was supposed to rescue had been killed. Soon after, Lucian shouted Fidorence's name, showing surprise. Meanwhile, Nerian demanded that the enemy reveal themselves, but he admitted he didn't know what they looked like. After that, Najin paused briefly, thoughtful. At that moment, Nuljan charged forward with a powerful punch. However, the blow passed right through the enemy, who remained motionless. Soon after, he felt the impact of a strong attack on his own leg. Thus, Zeus was breathing heavily, showing concern about what had happened. In response, Nerian confronted him, questioning whether he was really the knight and mocking his defeat by a mere subordinate. With that, Zeus concluded that the skeleton was stronger than it looked and considered using that. However, he wondered if he should resort to that measure there, realizing that if he didn't, everyone would die. Meanwhile, Nerian grew disappointed in him and promised to end the fight before her frustration increased. Soon, Nuljan used the galaxy style, Thunder, without any more restraint, charging forward quickly. Then he struck a direct blow, but also received one in return. Nuljan felt the impact of the counterattack. Immediately, Zeus shouted his name, worried about him. Meanwhile, Lucian watched with a tense and frightened expression. She then clenched her fist in frustration and anger, but even while showing her indignation, she knew she could only stand still. She thought she would just be a burden if she joined the fight, being too weak, so she gripped the sword hilt, thinking of how pathetic her situation was. Even so, she wanted to help and fight. Lucian also wanted to be strong, but suddenly, someone called her name. She turned, asking if that was Najin. In response, her eyes widened in surprise. Soon, Schumann held the sword, asking if he was talking about her. Najin confirmed with a gesture toward the blade and asked if it would be difficult. Schumann answered that no, it was possible, and asked how it should be done. At that moment, he remembered that she had said it didn't work on anything too large. Then he swung the sword, and Lucian called out to him, concerned. He whispered to hurry, and the sword began to glow with energy. Then, the blade surged forward quickly. Lucian watched the approaching sword, perplexed. Her eyes soon widened in shock at what was happening. Meanwhile, the icy ground was already marked with several drops of blood. On the other side, Nuljan was still fighting his opponent. Zeus, for his part, believed he was at his limit, just like his comrade, and thought someone would die if things continued that way. So he decided he had no choice and needed to use that. Soon, a sword was thrown, surprising everyone. Meanwhile, Schumann watched the scene without understanding anything, while helping Yolnia. Then, the blade landed on a neck. Najin held Lucian with a sword close to her throat, asking both sides to stop. With that, Nuljan was shocked, asking what he was doing. Zeus remained tense and thoughtful. Soon, Narian approached, asking what was going on there. Najin stated that it was him, and Lujin looked at him, asking the reason for that action. He thought that it posed a huge risk. Thus, he interpreted that Narian was referring to a spy infiltrated among them. From this, he deduced that since the other didn't know the traitor's face, it was a suspicious alliance. Then he apologized for not speaking up earlier and declared that he would become the spy they were looking for. Despite the tension, he realized Narian wasn't easy to fool, but he believed his predictions might work. Even if it was just a guess and a risk, he knew he had his own reasons. At that moment, his hand gripped the sword tightly. Then Narian replied that if that were the case, he should lead the way. Najin nodded. He soon understood that the other had believed him because of the sword he was holding. With that, he concluded that the skeleton had allied with the masked bandits. Meanwhile, the ice desert revealed a large hole in the center. Then Yolnia was healed with magic. She seemed to feel the effects of the healing as she began to awaken. At that moment, Noljin approached, asking if she was okay. Right after, Zeus ordered her to treat her injury. She responded that she would, while he remained thoughtful. Next, he turned to Lujin, asking what had happened to the other trainees. She replied that she didn't know, as they had gotten separated. Zeus then asked about the wild dog. Lujin said she didn't know either, since he told them to flee while he was wounded, and she apologized for not fighting alongside him. Seriously, Zeus explained that it wasn't her fault, as fighting by his side could have resulted in both of their deaths. He then advised her to learn from the experience to strengthen her resolve. He also said that instead of worrying, she should focus on becoming stronger. With that, she silently agreed. Right after, Zeus returned to his thoughts, internally questioning what Najin might be thinking. Meanwhile, Najin was asking for the attacks to stop. Narian, surprised, asked what was going on. Holding Lujin, Najin told him and the others that they needed to leave immediately, as they could take care of the others later. Narian asked if that was an order. Najin insisted, saying he would explain everything along the way. Then the other looked at him in silence, noticing his serious gaze. Shortly after, Zeus also asked if they should go. Already in the forest, Narian pressed him again, asking why they had let the others live. He stated that Najin had acted that way to hide the real reason and demanded a convincing explanation, warning there would be consequences otherwise. Najin replied that he understood, but that, in truth, there wasn't a clear reason. He explained that he acted on impulse, simply to save everyone, and that the most important part was still to come. Right after, he stated that from that moment on, his life would depend on every word he spoke. With that, he said he first needed more information, asking if Narian remembered the mission. Then he thought of using the conversation to extract more details. Narian pulled him close, laughing at the mention of the mission and saying he would cooperate only because of the royal decree. Even uncomfortable, Najin apologized, internally noticing the mutual distrust between the two. As he let him go, Narian warned him about his way of speaking and thought he was arrogant, someone who didn't care to hide it. Najin wiped his face, imagining the other considered him inferior, though he acknowledged his strength and confidence. Even so, he thought maybe it was better that way, as Narian wouldn't worry too much about him. Soon after, the other confronted him again, asking why he had changed his mind about killing the tricksters, since they themselves had asked for it. Then he replied that they should send the mages to the capital, thinking his words needed to keep flowing. Cautiously, he reasoned that to hide his intentions, it would be better to keep them alive, since Cerulean Kylan was clever. At that, the other frowned, asking why. He explained that no one entered the capital without a magical device, something the tricksters needed to analyze. Meanwhile, his conversation partner remained alert. Still focused, he kept a firm tone. Even knowing it was a lie, he reflected that the authentication process for the Emperor's castle did in fact exist. Based on that truth, he reasoned he could build lies around it, creating a convincing story. He soon concluded that the version sounded plausible, even if unverifiable, as the other wasn't likely to probe further and already showed mere dissatisfaction. Next, he was questioned about the true necessity of it all. He then considered giving vague answers, allowing them to be interpreted freely. Thus, the other ended up accepting, saying he would confirm the details with the leader and ordering him to lead the way. They soon began walking, and as they moved through the forest, he reflected that his sword being recognized was a sign the other knew the bandit leader. Although the situation was not ideal, he saw it as an opportunity to gain information. Even so, he knew he had to endure until he was rescued and wondered which direction to take. Suddenly, a scream interrupted his thoughts. Lujin was calling Fidorence's name in fear. In the distance, Zeus and Yolnia watched attentively. With that, Fidorence appeared running, panting, and visibly wounded. As Schumann approached, he revealed that the enemy was strong and had the ability to create illusions, but he didn't understand how they worked. Meanwhile, Zeus, relieved to see him alive, asked why he hadn't used Kaiten. He replied that he wasn't good at it and had already explained that before, making the other sigh. However, noticing some people were missing, he frowned in concern and asked where the others were. Zeus, with a serious expression, explained to him and to Schumann that they still didn't know what had happened and that they needed to find the two apprentices. As for Najin, Luzhin remained serious without saying a word, so Zeus preferred to conclude they would talk about it later. Fidorince nodded, wiping his face, and asked what they would do next. Zeus stated that, except for Luzhin, everyone had only superficial wounds and had already been treated, but they still needed to recover their strength. He also said that he had called the knights, though they would take days to arrive. Soon after, he looked to the side, reflecting on the moment when everyone would finally reunite. With that, Schumann showed confusion. He kept his eyes closed for a moment, lost in thought. And then he added that they needed to carry on with their work, as their lives had been at risk since the moment they joined the special class. Meanwhile, the two continued walking through the forest, immersed in uncertainty. Meanwhile, Ludica remembered that members of the special class would always have their lives at risk when carrying out missions. Then Zeus stated they would do their job, since everyone's life had been on the line from the moment they joined the special class, and then asked the mage to leave. With that, Schumann acknowledged the truth of the situation with a brief reflection. Soon after, Luzhin questioned Nejin's betrayal, even though he was rude. Thus, she recalled the moment she was hurt by him. Next, she touched her face, thoughtful and worried. Even so, she insisted that he must have had a reason for his behavior, even if she didn't know what it was. On the third day, a dark-cloaked figure walked through the forest, with Najin just ahead. Along the way, he wondered if no one had noticed what he was doing, while the dark figure silently followed behind. Gradually, he considers that being seen as a traitor might be better than being used as bait and then abandoned. Soon, he recalls past moments when they were still fighting. Then, Zeus is shown with a serious expression. With that in mind, Najin believes he must be aware of the situation and hopes the worst doesn't happen, since they are knights. Farther ahead, Nerian asks about the distance but soon fears that the skeleton might notice something. In response, Zeus says that Weron hasn't arrived yet because he didn't inform him, to avoid compromising the plan. After that, he declares that it's time to begin the game, looking at the other members of the group. At that moment, Najin questions himself about the spy's identity, carefully observing his surroundings. As he walks, he considers the possibility of other infiltrators besides Luce, trying to identify the most likely candidates. Suddenly, he widens his eyes upon noticing something unexpected. He quickly recalls that a certain individual reacted exactly as one of the masked bandits would. From this, he concludes that based on that reaction, he can guess who the others are, recognizing the importance of that contact. Even without definitive proof or knowing the exact number of spies, he decides it's useless to dwell on it now and chooses to try a different approach. Then he reflects on the masked bandits' objective and whether they were discussing the knights in a friendly or hostile way. Looking at the skeleton beside him, he considers that the alliance with the Eastern continent makes a hostile intent more likely. He soon believes the answer will become clearer once he can observe the sky-blue raccoon. Finally, he wonders if the bandits' goal is to win a war against the Eastern continent, doubting their Eastern origin due to their connection with the skeleton. At that moment, the skeleton comments that he seems to have many thoughts. Faced with that, Nejin replies that the skeleton's presence makes him nervous. Even so, he decides that for now he should try to gather information, and to do so, he chooses to flatter him, attempting to gain his favor by calling him amazing. However, the skeleton remains silent. Soon after, he reveals that he doesn't like flatterers. Najin then shows surprise at the revelation. The skeleton explains that there were people like that in his homeland who clouded the king's judgment. He goes on to say that he showed what fate awaited disloyal subjects. Najin then panics, realizing he said the wrong thing. However, the skeleton comments that he's in his current state because of that, though he corrects Najin's initial assumption. Trying to reconnect, Najin states that bitter medicine is good for one's health, and that the skeleton must have felt wrong. But the skeleton affirms that he acted out of loyalty and has no regrets, hoping that one day the king will understand. Soon after, he acknowledges that Najin seems to be a good judge of character. Thus, Nejin continues to praise him, saying that the king will soon understand his actions and that not even the knights compared to him, while thinking about the Kai energy of the Eastern continent. Suddenly, the skeleton interrupts him abruptly. Najin then shows confusion at the interruption. Next, the other reveals that what was seen was the power of his spear, expressing disappointment in the knight's strength and claiming he hadn't even needed to use his Kai. With that, Najin understands, wondering if that wasn't the opponent's full power. He soon concludes that he isn't lying and that even if the knights arrive, they'll be at a disadvantage. The skeleton reveals that this is Ki, a martial arts technique of the dragon. He then demonstrates a powerful strike that cuts through everything around. Immediately, Najin watches, impressed by the display of strength. He then thanks him for allowing him to witness such power, feeling honored. However, the skeleton interrupts him again, revealing that the demonstration was a warning and giving him 1 minute to correct himself. Faced with this, Najin confusedly asks what he meant and if he said something wrong. Meanwhile, the other keeps a serious and intimidating expression. Frightened, Najin realizes the gravity of the situation and desperately tries to figure out where he went wrong. He quickly repeats that the skeleton makes him nervous and that he's amazing, while thinking he needs to figure out his mistake fast. In a final effort, he insists that the knights are no match for him and that the king will soon understand his actions, mentioning the curious Ki technique from the Eastern continent, while a tree cracks beside them. Next, the tree is destroyed by the skeleton's power. At that moment, Neijin shows a look of pure shock. He then admits he doesn't know where he went wrong, while the other prepares to act. Desperate, he guesses that the mistake is related to the connection between the skeleton and the masked bandits. He soon regrets that his plan didn't work and blames his own carelessness. In the next moment, a powerful blow comes from above. Terrified, he looks up with intensity as the strike approaches. Meanwhile, Zeus thinks that he was arrogant and recalls that by entering the special class, they all put their lives on the line. With seriousness, he watches the scene, his thoughts focused on what is to come. Then the skeleton launches a strong attack, but Ludica protects her companion with her red umbrella. Najin reacts with shock to the unexpected scene. At the same moment, Durang advances with a weapon, ready to strike the opponent. With determination, she maintains focus as she takes a firm step. Finally, Zeus reaffirms that they will risk their lives and begins the operation to recapture Najin. Months earlier, the story unfolds on the eastern continent coast. At that time, the skeleton explains that one of their members will meet them halfway to guide them. Soon after, two masked figures express confidence in their work, recalling that they were the first spear and that the king will be pleased. In response, the skeleton points his spear at them. With firmness, he warns them not to speak his name in vain, stating that it is not their place to do so. Then one of the figures apologizes for the grave mistake, promising to take the warning seriously. Faced with that, he remains silent. Next, the other figure comments that they hope to work with him now that they are together. Meanwhile, back in the present, Zeus is shown with a serious expression. At that moment, Lujin states that Najin may be rude, but she doesn't see him as a traitor. She then continues, believing he cornered himself with the intention of saving the group's lives. Still, she reacts with surprise, not understanding Zeus' previous words. Then he sighs and explains that it's very likely Najin didn't betray them, since that kind of sacrifice is more common for a knight than for an apprentice. Even while distrusting many things and disapproving of how the other acted, he says the group has only one choice left. Thus, Durang advances with determination, while Zeus adds that they must recapture him. Suddenly, she shouts that something is coming. In response, she launches a powerful strike with her sword. The attack hits a silhouette, scattering particles into the air. Soon, the energy dissipates, leaving a trail. Durang is surprised to realize the skeleton wasn't affected. Right after, he leaps after being hit by the umbrella. Observing the scene, he tries to locate the culprit. At that moment, Ludica hurls him far using her small umbrella. With the impact, Nerion slides backward. Irritated, he glares at the group with fury. Then, Durang steps forward with Zeus and Ludica, declaring they are the knights. In a mocking tone, Zeus tells Nerion it was hard taking care of the bastard and that they came to retrieve what's theirs. Immediately, Najin reacts in shock to the scene. Sensing the tension, Nerion quickly gets ready. Meanwhile, Zeus comments that the skeleton's abilities are unknown and seem to nullify attacks, making repeated blows useless. Therefore, he warns the group not to lower their guard, assuring them he'll be watching everything. With that, the skeleton begins a dragon martial arts attack. Meanwhile, a flock of birds flies frightened through the sky. A short distance ahead, Fitterance, wounded, laments not being allowed to join due to his injury, even though the other is in similar condition. In response, Luzine gasps and coughs, saying they can't keep running, while the others appear exhausted in the background. Then Fitterance praises his effort and tells him to rest for a minute, and then do it all over again. With that, Schumann reflects that everyone's training is extremely harsh. Suddenly, the three react in surprise at hearing something unexpected. At that moment, a powerful wave of energy spreads across the landscape. At the same time, everyone is still fighting the skeleton in an intense battle. He stares at them with eyes full of rage. Meanwhile, Durang shows exhaustion from the fight. Zeus also shows signs of fatigue. Soon after, Ludica grips her umbrella tightly, ready to act. Without delay, she charges in for an attack, but it's impossible to hit him. Next, Zeus watches closely, reflecting on his next move. Then Durang rushes in with sword in hand, announcing her arrival. With that, she delivers a quick blow. The impact hits the skeleton hard. Despite this, she's surprised to realize the attack had no effect. In response, Nerion prepares his spear and activates dragon martial arts. Meanwhile, Durang tries to endure the multiple strikes hitting her. Gasping and disbelieving, she asks if anyone saw the skeleton block her attack and questions what exactly he is. Najin watches everything, feeling powerless before the scene. Even without learning what he had hoped to, he reflects on his next steps, remembering that Nerion still sees him as a spy. In that moment, the skeleton keeps his gaze fixed on all of them. Then Najin grips his sword tightly, thinking about how to use the last remaining spell on the blade. Faced with the impasse, he considers whether he should join the knights and return with them. On the other hand, he ponders whether it would be better to remain with the skeleton to try and obtain more information. Even divided, he faces the situation, knowing he must make a crucial decision. Suddenly, an intense and brilliant explosion takes over the area. During the action, Durang, while sliding, exclaims that the skeleton isn't moving, and Zeus watches him closely. With apprehension, Najin swallows hard. Right after, he grips his sword firmly and announces that he has made his decision. At last, he decides to risk his life once again. While Waron is sitting on the plaza floor, the others remain standing around him. Thus, he stays there, calmly tapping his spear on the ground. Soon, Quering asks if that is the meeting point, and he confirms with a nod. Then Jarun questions why they hadn't seen them earlier, but Waron replies that he doesn't know. Still, he remains seated in the center of the plaza, surrounded by the others. It is then explained that the dragon martial arts is a combat style created specifically to fight dragons. However, this technique is extremely difficult, and only 2 people have ever mastered it. Meanwhile, everyone continues to battle the skeleton amid the intense fight. Nirien, with surprising speed, moves as she prepares for a precise attack. Then Durang asks what exactly that creature is and comments that it doesn't seem normal. At the same time, Najin wonders whether they'll end up destroying the entire forest and if they're still truly human. With that, he looks at the devastated landscape, mourning the precious trees that have been destroyed, while hearing the booms of battle in the background. At last, he realizes that if he enters the fight directly, he'll be destroyed like the trees and decides to search for an opening to attack. Meanwhile, Ludica asks Zeus how they can defeat the skeleton, but she replies that they have no chance and should focus on minimizing damage. Then, Zeus asks Durang if she heard her. With firmness, she instructs her to read the situation and act cautiously. Soon after, Durang charges forward once again to attack the enemy. She then delivers a powerful strike that causes a large crack in the ground. However, she stomps in frustration, angry that she can't make progress. At that moment, the skeleton suddenly appears behind her. With a strong blow, he strikes her sword with precision. Quickly, he prepares another attack. With brutality, he uses the dragon martial arts to deliver a devastating blow. In doing so, he breaks Durang's sword with his technique. As a result, she is thrown by the impact of the strike. Soon, Ludica catches her, even while complaining about the pain she feels in the process. It becomes clear that Durang is suffering greatly from the impact. Then, everyone stops for a moment in the middle of the forest, trying to catch their breath. Ludica, still holding her friend, asks if she wants to die and tells her to take it easier. In response, Durang only thanks her. Meanwhile, Najin notices a vulnerability in the skeleton and announces that it's time to act, moving quickly toward him. With a dark gaze, the creature watches them in silence. Soon, Ludica, Durang, and Zeus prepare for another charge. At last, the skeleton remains still, while behind him a mysterious sword appears. Then Najin, wielding his sword, announces that he will join the skeleton. With that, Ludica, Durang, and Zeus are shocked by the declaration. Soon he stares directly at the enemy, his eyes reflecting the blade's light. He then reveals his determination, while the blade emits a sound like cracking air. The 3 react in shock to the sudden boom that echoes through the forest. At that moment, Ludica realizes that the boy's killing intent is actually directed at them. With urgency, Durang warns Zeus to get ready, and both leap into action. Meanwhile, Najin thinks that nothing he does can kill the monsters, but if his goal is small, he might reach it at the right moment. Then the skeleton comments that he appreciates those thoughts, though he doesn't need help, and tells him to hurry up. Immediately after, a deep slash appears on his arm. With precision, Najin delivered a clean blow to the enemy. To the creature's surprise, his wrist begins to bleed, putting him in an unexpected situation. However, instead of trying to understand what happened, the experienced general acts immediately, calling him ungrateful. Thus, the skeleton charges with a powerful punch. At that moment, Zeus appears and shields the boy from the impact. Najin thinks he knew he could trust the knights. Suddenly, at insane speed, he is grabbed by Ludica's umbrella. The enemy's killing intent grows even more, now that he has been betrayed. Quickly, Zeus shouts Durang's name, telling her to act now. In response, she leaps into the air, preparing to strike with full force. Soon, she delivers a powerful blow that crashes into the ground. Stones and debris are launched into the sky from the impact. The area around them is engulfed in a dense cloud of smoke. In the middle of it, the silhouette of the skeleton emerges, revealing a distortion in the air. With a cold voice, he admits that he underestimated everyone there and promises to show the true power of dragon martial arts. He then moves swiftly across the already destroyed terrain. Meanwhile, everyone retreats, and he claims that what happened was just pure luck. Durang, irritated, scolds Najin for his recklessness, warning that the attack only worked by chance and that he must not try something so risky again. He tries to justify himself, but Ludica interrupts, firmly calling his name. Najin simply looks at her and responds. With a slight smile, she praises him for a good job. Surprised, he reacts and thanks her, still flustered. Then Durang questions him, surprised by what she sees. He explains that he lost control of his other sword and that this one seemed useful at the moment. In the distance, the skeleton is seen with an increasingly intense and threatening aura. With growing rage, he declares he will follow Najin to the end and tear him apart piece by piece, while clenching his fist tightly. Without backing down, Najin grips his sword firmly, hoping it will continue to be useful. Then they ask where the search team, composed of Lyman and Mjolsa, is. Immediately after, Yolnia says she's ready to train and feels better, while Anuljan comments that they need to hurry the search so they can return quickly. With that, he spots smoke in the distance and suggests searching in that direction. Meanwhile, Lucian runs, exhausted and out of breath. At that moment, with a serious look, Zeus asks to be told something important. Then he questions the group, including Najin, about what they discovered over the last 3 days. When Najin meets his gaze, he asks if Zeus is suspicious of him. Zeus counters, asking if he should be, and states that he doesn't like wasting time. He then pressures him to reveal what he may have learned about the identity or intentions of the skeleton. Najin nods, ready to answer. He confesses that, honestly, he learned nothing, as he spent the past 3 days walking a thin line between life and death. Right after, he says the only thing he truly discovered is followed by the sound of something hitting a nearby surface. He then looks at the skeleton, who gestures with his hand. In response, the skeleton asks if he's being ordered to eat weeds, showing himself to be quite demanding. Faced with that, Najin thinks that kind of information probably wasn't necessary. Even so, he accepts. Then he opens his eyes and declares that it doesn't matter if he didn't discover anything. Next, he continues, explaining that the creature joined a group and already knew some things. His eyes remain fixed. At that moment, Durang, Zeus, Ludica, and Fidorance react with surprise and question him about the masks. Calmly, he clarifies that what he said before hadn't revealed everything, but that the skeleton had allied with people wearing masks with engraved patterns. Soon, 3 masked figures are seen. He reveals that their goal was to assassinate the knights, and that they would use whatever they had available to do it. The group reacts with shock, and Najin thinks this is due to the time he spent with the skeleton. He then reveals that there's a spy in the second special class, believing he might be one of the masked ones, and assures them his words have weight. Next, Durang looks surprised, and Zeus asks if he's serious, and whether he has any idea who it could be. Firmly, he says he hasn't figured it out yet, but has a few guesses, stating that this isn't a shot in the dark, and that he will share what he knows for certain. He adds that if given the opportunity, he could get them out of there. Out of curiosity, Zeus asks how he would do that, while Lucian comments that they had stopped running. Fidorance adds that it's fine and that it's a good thing. Soon after, Najin opens his eyes abruptly. At the same time, Wadran and the other group members breathe heavily. Then he asks where the others are, and Fidorance explains that Lyamin and Mjolsa haven't returned. That's why Yolnia and Nuljan went to find them and should return at any moment. With that, Najin reacts in shock and asks what happened. Elsewhere, Lyamin and Mjolsa are camped in a clearing with a campfire. Soon, Nuljan and Yolnia arrive, relieved, and ask why they were still there and hadn't returned yet. In response, Mjolsa explains that they were attacked by a terrifying skeleton and that she suggested hiding until help arrived, adding that the creature was outrageous. Then Nuljan says they encountered it too and tried to fight, but it was beyond their capabilities, and he asks if they were proud of running away. However, Yolnia responds that if it weren't for Najin, they all would have died. Surprised, Mjolsa asks if they really tried to fight it and how they were still alive, wanting to know what Najin did and if he managed to destroy it.
Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.